tomato gravy on toast. That was Tuesday in a 1950s kitchen. Onion sandwiches on white bread with nothing but mayonnaise. That was Thursday. Fried potato cakes from yesterday's mashed potatoes, browned in bacon grease. That was the rest of the week. Not one of those meals had a name, not one came from a cookbook, and the women who made them never once stopped to measure. One meal further down this list is nothing but flour and water, cooked in a way most kitchens today would not even recognize. Another stretches a single pound of hamburger with a cup of oatmeal into a dinner for 5, and if your mother ever made it, you can still taste it right now. These are 100 easy meals that 50s housewives made without a recipe, the ones their families still talk about, and the ones that disappeared when the women who carried them stopped cooking. Number 20. Horehound drops, dried horehound leaves steeped in boiling water until the liquid turned dark, then strained and mixed with sugar and a little corn syrup. You boiled the whole thing to hard crack, poured it onto a greased slab, and scored it into small squares before it set. The flavor hit you sideways. Bitter and earthy at the front, sweet at the finish, and something almost medicinal underneath that you could not quite name. Horehound grew wild across most of the country, along fence rows and in neglected yards, and people had been boiling it into candy for longer than anyone alive could remember. Grandmothers kept a jar on the kitchen counter and handed one to any child with a cough or a sore throat, no doctor required. The bitterness was the whole point. It was supposed to taste like that. You learned to like it, or you left it alone, and most people who grew up with it never stopped reaching for one. Drugstores carried commercial horehound drops well into the 1960s, but the homemade version was darker, rougher, and stronger. It tasted like the yard it came from. Number 19. Potato soup. 5 or 6 potatoes peeled and cubed, dropped into a pot with a chopped onion, a couple stalks of celery, and enough water to cover. You let it boil until the potatoes were falling apart, then you added a generous pour of milk, a lump of butter, and salt and pepper. Some cooks mashed part of the potatoes against the side of the pot with a wooden spoon to thicken the broth while leaving the rest in chunks. Others ran a fork through the whole thing until it was smooth. Either way, the result was a bowl of soup so thick and warm that it could replace any other dish on a cold night. Potato soup was the meal of last resort in the best possible sense. When the paycheck was 3 days away and the cupboard was almost bare, there were always potatoes. They were cheap by the sack. They kept for weeks in a cool, dark place, and they stretched a meal further than almost any other vegetable. A pot of potato soup fed 4 people for a few cents, and nobody felt deprived eating it. In mining towns and mill towns, this was a regular Thursday or Friday dinner when the week's groceries were running low. The women who made it did not follow recipes. They adjusted by feel. More milk if the potatoes were starchy, more butter if the family needed something richer, a handful of shredded cheese stirred in at the end if there was any left in the icebox. The soup changed every time, but it always did the same thing. It told you someone cared enough to stand at the stove. Leftover potato soup went back on the burner the next day. It thickened overnight into something closer to a chowder, and some families preferred it that way. A single batch could carry a household through 2 or 3 meals without anyone feeling like they were eating the same thing twice. Number 20. Chicken a la king. This was one of the most popular dishes in America for about 30 years, and then it vanished almost completely. You started with leftover chicken, diced it up, and stirred it into a thick cream sauce with peas, mushrooms, and pimentos. The sauce started with a lump of butter in a hot pan, a handful of flour stirred in, and milk added slowly until it thickened into something rich and glossy. Half the recipes from this era began the same way. You served it over toast, over rice, or inside a pastry shell if you were feeling ambitious. Restaurants served it on fine china. Hotel dining rooms put it on the menu alongside steaks and chops. It was considered a refined dish, and it barely dented the grocery budget because the whole point was using up chicken that had already been roasted the night before. Every scrap had a second life. By the late 1960s, chicken a la king started showing up in frozen dinner trays and canned versions, and that was the beginning of the end. Once something moves from the hotel dining room to the freezer aisle, it loses its identity. People stopped associating it with home cooking and started associating it with convenience food. The fresh version disappeared from kitchens, and the frozen version eventually disappeared from stores. What made this dish work was not the recipe itself. It was the logic behind it. You roasted a chicken on Sunday, and by Monday you had enough leftover meat to build a completely different dinner. The cream sauce transformed yesterday's roast into something that felt new and intentional. That kind of thinking used to be automatic. Today, it would be called a life hack. Back then, it was just what you did with what you had. Number 15. Raw packing vegetables straight into jars. Instead of blanching or cooking vegetables before canning them, you packed them into jars raw. Green beans, carrots, beets, corn cut straight off the cob. You filled the jar tight, poured boiling water or brine over the top, left a half-inch of headspace, and sealed it. The pressure canner did the rest. Raw-packed vegetables held their texture better than cooked ones because they only got heated once inside the jar. Amish cooks preferred this method for anything they wanted to stay crisp. You opened a jar of raw packed green beans in winter, and they still had a snap to them that blanched beans never could. It saved time on canning day too, because you skipped the blanching step entirely. Number 22. Lumber camp beans. Baked beans were the backbone of camp cooking across every timber region in the country from Maine to Oregon. Navy beans soaked overnight in cold water, then went into a deep cast iron pot with chunks of salt pork, dark molasses, dry mustard, and onions sliced thin. The pot sat in the oven or beside the stove for the better part of a full day. By supper time, the beans were dark, sweet, thick enough to eat with a fork, and the salt pork had melted into the mass until you could not tell where the meat ended and the beans began. Every cook had a slightly different recipe, and every cook believed his was the best in the territory. In some camps, the men judged a new cook entirely by his first batch of beans. If the beans were good, the rest would follow. If the beans were bad on the first night, men started asking around about openings at the next camp down the road. The pot was never fully empty. As soon as one batch came out, the next went in to soak. Beans with bread was breakfast. Beans with salt pork was dinner. Cold beans from the pot was what a man ate standing up if he came in late from the landing after dark. The cost of a full pot was next to nothing, and the calories it produced fueled more board feet of timber than any other single dish in the history of American logging. The bean pot was the heartbeat of the camp kitchen. If it stopped, everything else did too. Number 15. Ham and lima bean casserole. Leftover ham cut into cubes, frozen lima beans, and a can of cream of mushroom soup. You mixed everything together in a baking dish, topped it with buttered breadcrumbs, and baked it until the edges bubbled. The mushroom soup was the sauce, which meant you did not need to make a roux or measure anything beyond opening a can. Lima beans were everywhere in the 1950s. They showed up in casseroles, soups, and side dishes because they were cheap and available frozen year-round. Most children hated them. Most mothers served them anyway. This casserole was the dinner nobody asked for and nobody complained about. It filled the plate, it used up the ham, and it was done in 40 minutes. By the late 1950s, frozen dinners started showing up in grocery stores, and the promise was hard to resist. A full meal on a tray, ready in 20 minutes, no planning required. Swanson put a turkey dinner in an aluminum tray and called it a television dinner, and within a few years, the entire idea of cooking from scratch on a weeknight started to feel old-fashioned. The meals on this list did not disappear because they tasted bad. They disappeared because they took time, and time was the one thing the modern kitchen was designed to eliminate. A casserole that baked for an hour lost to a tray that heated in 20 minutes. A soup that simmered all afternoon lost to a can that opened in 2 seconds. The trade was speed for flavor, and most families made it without looking back. What they gave up was not just a recipe. It was the smell of a kitchen that had been working all day. Number 15. The Saturday night T-bone. Once or twice a summer, your father splurged on T-bone steaks. He brought them home wrapped in white butcher paper And the whole family knew what was coming because he built the fire an hour earlier than usual and did not let anyone near the grill. The coals had to be white hot. He laid the steaks down and did not move them for 4 minutes, then flipped once. He seasoned them with nothing but salt and coarse pepper, and he refused to hear of anything else. A T-bone ran about 89 cents a pound in 1958, and 2 steaks fed a family of 4 if you divided them right. He cut the strip side for himself and your mother and gave the kids the tenderloin side. Nobody explained that arrangement. You just noticed years later that your father always took the bigger piece with the bone and you got the smaller piece that was somehow more tender. He was splitting a luxury cut so everyone ate well and he never said a word about it. There is something most people forget about the 1950s backyard. The grill was not a hobby. It was not a lifestyle or a brand identity. Your father did not own a cookbook about smoking or curing or anything with the word artisanal on the cover. He owned a grill because the hardware store sold one for $8, and standing outside in the evening with a cold drink was better than sitting inside watching the same 3 channels on the television. But something happened out there that nobody admitted at the time. It was the one meal he made from start to finish without asking for help, without following instructions, without deferring to anyone. He chose the cut. He built the fire. He stood over it. And when it was done, he fed you. That is not a small thing for a man who spent the whole week at a job he never once talked about at the dinner table. The kitchen garden was not a hobby. It was a line item in the household budget that happened to grow in the dirt. Tomatoes along the back fence, herbs by the kitchen door, squash spreading wherever it pleased, and a compost pile in the corner that turned coffee grounds, eggshells, and potato peels back into soil. Researchers at the University of Bristol discovered that Mycobacterium vaccae, a bacterium naturally found in garden soil, triggers serotonin production and reduces anxiety, which means digging in the dirt was doing more for her mental health than she knew. Victory gardens from the war years had taught a generation how to grow food, and many kept their plots going well into the 1960s. Neighbors traded surplus over the fence, zucchini for tomatoes, basil for green onions, and the whole block ate better for it. Nobody called it farm to table. They just called it the garden. Number 14, vinegar pie. When a farm wife in rural Arkansas in 1952 did not have apples, lemons, or any fruit at all, she made vinegar pie. Flour, sugar, butter, a couple of eggs, and plain white vinegar. That was the entire filling. The vinegar mimicked the tartness of lemon or apple. The sugar balanced it out. The eggs set it into something custard-like and smooth. One pie cost about 12 cents. A bottle of white vinegar ran a nickel and lasted for weeks. It sounds wrong. It sounds like something nobody would eat on purpose. The women who made it knew exactly what they were doing. They had learned it from their mothers, who had learned it during the Depression, when fruit was a luxury most families could not afford. In the Ozarks, vinegar pie was so common that some families did not even know apple pie existed until they moved to town. This was not a substitute. It was a tradition. It tasted better than it had any right to. The food industry was pushing frozen dinners and cake mixes by 1954. In rural America, millions of families could not afford any of it. They were still cooking the way their grandmothers had cooked, not by choice, but by necessity. Vinegar pie was proof of that. It was a dessert made from ingredients that cost almost nothing, by women who refused to let their families go without something sweet at the end of the meal. The food industry did not see these women. Advertisers did not target them. They fed their families anyway, with whatever they had. What they had, more often than not, was enough. Number 19, chicken croquettes. This was Horn and Hardart's single best-selling item for years. They made so many of these on any given day that the kitchen crew started rolling them before dawn, and on a busy afternoon the compartments were empty by noon. The recipe was straightforward. Cooked chicken, usually dark meat because it had more flavor, was pulled from the bone, chopped fine, and folded into a thick bechamel sauce with a touch of nutmeg and white pepper. The mixture went into the icebox to firm up overnight, then was shaped into oval logs, rolled through flour, dipped in egg wash, coated in fine breadcrumbs, and fried in clean oil until the crust turned the color of a new penny. They came two to a plate with a pool of chicken gravy and a side of creamed peas, and they cost $0.25. The inside was soft, almost custard-like, and the crust held everything together until you broke through it with your fork. People lined up for chicken croquettes the way people today stand in line for the newest gadget. The difference is that a chicken croquette actually fed you. Horn and Hardart reportedly served more chicken croquettes in a single day across their locations than many sit-down restaurants served of their entire menu in a week. When the company shuttered its last location, the chicken croquette effectively disappeared from American dining. You can still find versions at a few old hotel restaurants, but the automat version, the one fried to order and sitting behind that glass door still sizzling, that one is gone for good. Number 15. Sloppy Joe Manhattan Style. The Sloppy Joe you remember from a school cafeteria tray was not the original. The original was a triple-decker deli sandwich invented at the Town Hall Deli in South Orange, New Jersey, in the early 1930s and adopted by Manhattan lunch counters by 1948. 3 slices of seeded rye, 2 layers of thinly sliced corned beef and Swiss, a layer of coleslaw, and a coat of Russian dressing between the layers. The whole sandwich was cut into quarters and pinned with toothpicks like a small flag held the thing together. You could eat one in 5 minutes and walk back to the office full. The deli claimed the recipe came home from a politician's vacation in Havana, where the bartender at a place called Sloppy Joe's served something similar with rum on the side. The story is more legend than history at this point, but the deli still tells it on the wall. The loose meat ground beef version came later out of Sioux City, Iowa, and took over the name by the late 40s. Articles about the cafeteria tray version were everywhere by 1957. One thing I noticed reading old menus is that the Manhattan version was always called Sloppy Joe with a capital, never Sloppy Joe lowercase, as if the name was a proper restaurant title. Most Americans today have no idea there were 2 completely different sandwiches called the same thing. The Manhattan one was better. Number 22. Cooking the wild songbirds off your own back porch. Picture yourself in a 1950s hill kitchen in late fall. Money is thin, the smokehouse is nearly empty, and the dogwoods outside are full of fat little birds gorging on berries before the cold sets in. Your grandfather hands you a slingshot or a fine net, and you go to work the way his people always did. You bring in a string of robins, maybe a few cedar waxwings or a brace of doves, and you pluck them at the kitchen table while the grease heats. You roll the little breasts in seasoned flour, drop them into the skillet, and in a few minutes you have a platter of crisp brown morsels that taste of the wild. You serve them over biscuits with the pan gravy poured on top, and nobody in that kitchen thinks they have done a single thing wrong because the woods were the pantry and a bird in the pot was just supper. Now here is what no one mentions when they romanticize that kind of self-reliance. Almost every one of those birds is protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, a law that makes it unlawful to pursue, take, capture, kill, or possess nearly 1,100 species without a federal permit. It does not matter whether the bird is alive or dead, whole or plucked. It does not matter that you ate it instead of mounting it. If you did today exactly what that grandfather taught you to do, you could face up to 6 months in jail and a fine reaching $15,000, and the game wardens could seize the very net you used. Robins, waxwings, and most of the small birds that once filled a lean seasoned skillet sit firmly on the protected list. The trick that once stretched a poor family through November is now one of the clearest lines in the whole countdown. Calf brain sandwiches sound unsettling now, but once they were a small-town delicacy. Served hot on toasted buns with onions and mustard, they were a common lunch in diners across the Midwest. Farmers loved them for their price and protein, and few thought twice about it. But by the 1950s, whispers of strange neurological diseases in livestock began circulating. Scientists could not prove much yet, but the fear was enough. Health departments issued warnings, and suddenly, brains on bread vanished from menus almost overnight. Diners stopped serving them, and butchers stopped selling them, more out of caution than law. It was one of the first modern examples of fear outpacing science, shaping what Americans felt safe eating. Those who remembered the sandwiches described them as tender, rich, and oddly comforting. but comfort was no match for paranoia. The calf-brain sandwich became a ghost of its own making, proof that appetite can turn to fear faster than any disease can spread. Number 21. Lime gelatin mold with cottage cheese. Lime jello, a can of crushed pineapple, and a scoop of cottage cheese mixed together and set in a copper ring mold overnight. It came out quivering, pale green and glistening, and your aunt placed it on a bed of iceberg lettuce like it was the centerpiece of the whole spread. Some versions had chopped walnuts, some had miniature marshmallows folded in. The color alone would stop a modern cook cold, but in the 1950s it looked festive. It looked like you tried. The combination of sweet, sour, and creamy worked better than it should have. Today, Jell-O is something you eat from a plastic cup, not something you unmold onto a platter and admire. The grill that changed the neighborhood. Before 1950, most Americans cooked indoors all year long. The 4th of July meant fried chicken and potato salad eaten on the porch. But somewhere around 1952, hardware stores started stacking bags of Kingsford charcoal briquettes by the front door, and men who had never cooked a meal in their lives suddenly wanted to stand outside and burn things over open flame. The backyard grill turned the 4th from a family meal into a block event. Neighbors walked over because they smelled the smoke. Kids ran through sprinklers while the coals turned white. The food was almost secondary to the gathering, but the gathering would not have happened without the food. It was a circle. The grill gave men permission to cook, and cooking gave the block permission to become a neighborhood for one afternoon a year. In the Louisiana Bayou country, crawfish were not purchased. They were caught by hand from the ditches and slow sloughs, pulled from muddy banks by children wading with buckets, trapped overnight with wire, raked from warming shallows between February and June. Cajun and Creole communities had built a culinary tradition around this freshwater crustacean, incorporating techniques from the indigenous peoples of the region, long before French Louisiana was a concept. A crawfish boil was communal by nature. You needed enough people to justify the fire, the pot, the corn and potatoes and andouille that went in alongside. The crawfish were still free. The table was newspaper spread on a backyard picnic table, and you ate standing up, peeling as you went, sucking the head for the fat the old cooks insisted was the best part. Today, crawfish runs $8 to $15 a pound. The bayou still produces them, but commercial harvesting has inserted a price into what once existed entirely outside the market. The ritual remains. The free part is gone. Number 19. Sugared almonds. Whole almonds, sugar, water, and a drop of vanilla. You boiled sugar and water into a thick syrup, stirred in the almonds, and kept stirring over heat until the syrup crystallized around each nut in a white crust. The pan hissed, and the sugar seized into chalky clumps before it melted again into a glossy shell. Getting through that ugly stage without burning the batch took steady heat and a strong arm that did not stop moving. The finished almonds came out coated in a thin, crackly layer of caramelized sugar that shattered between your molars. Wedding guests in the 1950s found 5 of these wrapped in tulle at every place setting. Italian families called them confetti and gave them at christenings, graduations, and engagements. The homemade ones had a rougher coat and a deeper caramel flavor than the factory version, and that roughness was how you knew someone stood over a hot stove and made them. The candy thermometer gave numbers to knowledge that already lived in a woman's hands. Before the thermometer, you tested candy by dropping a bead of hot sugar into cold water and feeling the result with your fingers. Softball, firm ball, hard crack. These were not stages you read about in a book. They were stages you felt. Your mother knew the difference the way a musician knows a wrong note, and even after the thermometer arrived on the kitchen wall, plenty of women never used one. They dropped, they pinched, they listened to the boil. The science was already in their hands before the instrument gave it a number. Number 21. Fried salt pork with milk gravy. A slab of salt pork sliced into thin strips, soaked in water to pull some of the brine out, then dredged in flour and fried in its own rendered fat until the edges curled and crisped. The drippings stayed in the skillet. You whisked in flour, poured in milk, and stirred until a thick white gravy formed around the brown bits stuck to the pan. Served over biscuits or boiled potatoes, This was a meal that families in Appalachia and across the rural South ate multiple times a week. Salt pork kept for months without refrigeration and cost next to nothing at the general store. The gravy stretched a few thin slices into a full plate, and the salt from the meat seasoned the whole dish without reaching for the shaker. Most of the women making these dinners did not choose it as a hobby. The kitchen was a workstation. Dinner happened every night at the same hour because the family expected it, the budget demanded it, and there was no alternative sitting in a paper bag at a drive-thru. That daily discipline created something no delivery app has ever reproduced. A table where people sat together, ate the same food, and stayed until the plates were cleared. You can order a meal to your door in 15 minutes today, and it will arrive in a bag you throw away before you sit on the couch alone. The meals were simple. The ritual around them was not. Number 30, creamed chipped beef on toast. The military called it something unprintable. Civilians just called it Tuesday. You took a jar of dried beef, shredded it, and dropped it into a thick cream sauce, just butter melted with a spoonful of flour and enough milk to loosen it. Poured the whole thing over toast and sat down. The plate was full in 5 minutes, and the cost was barely worth counting. The beef came in small glass jars and cost next to nothing, and the sauce stretched it far enough to fill a plate without complaint. Soldiers brought the recipe home after the war, and for about 10 years it showed up on kitchen tables from Pennsylvania to Oregon. By the late 1960s, it started disappearing. Dried beef got harder to find, and the name did not help. But anyone who grew up eating it remembers the taste before they remember the name. Number 14, shaking cream into butter in a glass jar. You poured fresh heavy cream into a quart mason jar, screwed the lid on tight, and started shaking. For the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. The cream just sloshed around. Then it thickened into whipped cream and you thought you were done. But you were not. You kept shaking, and right when your arms started to burn, something shifted. The fat separated from the liquid with a sudden thump, and you had a lump of golden butter sitting in a pool of pale buttermilk. You drained the buttermilk into a separate jar because that had its own uses in biscuits, pancakes, and salad dressings. Then you rinsed the butter under cold running water, working it with a wooden spoon or a pair of paddles, folding and pressing until the water ran clear. That rinsing step was the part most people skipped, and it was the part that mattered most. Buttermilk left inside the butter turned rancid within days. Properly rinsed butter lasted for weeks in a cool cellar. You pressed it into a wooden mold carved with a wheat sheaf or a flower, wrapped it in wax paper, and set it in the springhouse to firm up. The whole process took about 15 minutes and cost nothing beyond the cream. Amish children learned this before they could read. A 10-year-old standing on a stool, shaking a jar with both hands, was earning her place at the table. The buttermilk was never wasted. It went into cornbread, into soup, into anything that needed a little tang and a tender crumb. One jar of cream gave you 2 products, and both of them were better than anything wrapped in foil at the grocery store. Number 29, slab bacon and eggs, not strips, slabs. The camp cook cut bacon a 1/4 inch thick right off the side, laid it across a griddle the size of a door, and cracked eggs by the dozen into the grease that pooled around the edges. A man got 4 eggs minimum and enough bacon to cover his whole plate. There was no toast because bread was reserved for lunch pails going out to the landing. The bacon fat went into a tin bucket beside the stove and came back in everything else that week. Fried potatoes, gravy, biscuits, even the beans got a spoonful. Nothing in that kitchen existed by itself. Every meal fed the next one. Before I go further, for the folks who want more of these old recipes gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is available on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now back to the list. Number 18, macaroni and tomatoes. You boiled elbow macaroni until it was soft, drained it, and stirred in a can of stewed tomatoes with all the juice, a pat of butter, salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to cut the acid. That was the whole recipe. Some mothers added a handful of diced onion fried in the butter first. Others crumbled a few saltine crackers over the top. The dish came together in the time it took to boil water, and it tasted like something between a soup and a casserole. Warm and simple and slightly sweet from the tomatoes. This was the dinner nobody talked about because it barely qualified as cooking, but it showed up on tables across the Ohio Valley every single week. It was the filler meal, the one between grocery trips, the one that used two things every pantry already held. Number 19. Grilled pork chops with canned applesauce. Your father bought center-cut chops an inch thick from the meat counter, bone-in, because nobody asked for boneless in 1957. Salt was the seasoning, maybe garlic powder if your mother had some. He set them over medium coals after they lost the chill on the counter and watched them close because the trichinosis scare was real in every household, and your father would sooner serve a dry chop than make somebody sick. When the pink was gone, he pulled them off, and your mother opened a jar of Mott's applesauce. The sweetness cut through the char, and the cool sauce against the hot chop made every bite feel like two different meals. A jar of Mott's or Musselman's sat in every pantry in Middle America through the 1970s. Today, the pork chop came back boneless, thin-cut, and seasoned from a foil packet. The original, bone-in and grilled slow over charcoal with nothing but salt, is the one that vanished, and with it went the applesauce. Pull a dinner plate out of your cabinet right now and measure it. Chances are it runs 11 or 12 inches across. In the 1950s, the standard dinner plate measured 9 inches, and nobody left the table hungry. Researchers at Cornell University's Food and Brand Lab confirmed that plate size directly influences how much a person serves and eats, with larger plates leading to 20 to 30% more consumption without any increase in satisfaction. She did not read that study. She used the dishes she had, served a reasonable portion, and put the rest away. Dessert was fruit after most meals, with cake or pie reserved for Sundays and holidays. Not because she was restricting anything, but because sugar cost money and nobody expected sweets on a Wednesday. The smaller plate, the regular meal times, the understanding that snacking between meals was poor manners, the whole family practiced portion control without using the phrase. Number 20. Hoover stew. This meal was named after President Herbert Hoover, and not as a compliment. It started in the soup kitchens of the 1930s and never really left. By the 1950s, families were still making it because it worked. One hot dog, sliced thin, could flavor an entire pot. You added macaroni for bulk, canned tomatoes for acid and color. Maybe a can of corn if you had one. The whole pot fed a family of 5 for about 35 cents. A can of tomatoes cost 8 cents. A pack of macaroni cost a dime. The hot dog was another nickel. A woman in Gary, Indiana, in 1955 made Hoover stew every Friday night. She called it her end-of-the-week pot because it used whatever was left in the cupboard before grocery day. Nobody chose this meal. Everybody remembered it. The noodles soaked up the tomato broth. It was ugly and it was honest. That mattered. Number 12. Lamb stew. Shoulder lamb cut into chunks, browned hard and simmered with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and pearl onions in a thin broth seasoned with rosemary and black pepper. Automats in the Northeast served this from October through April, and it was cold weather food in the truest sense. Lamb was cheaper than beef in the 1950s, and most working families ate it without thinking twice. The stew sat behind the glass doors in deep bowls, and the steam fogged the compartment window from the inside. You grabbed it fast because there were only so many portions each day. It was brown, it was hot, and it stuck to your ribs. The meat had that slightly gamey flavor that some people loved and others had to learn to appreciate, but at the automat, nobody questioned it. Lamb stew has essentially vanished from everyday American cooking, and no chain restaurant serves it anymore. Number 18. Watercress with butter. Trimming the crusts with a wet knife was how the small ceremony started. The bread was crustless white, paper thin, spread with sweet butter from end to end. Watercress went on rinsed and picked over, laid in a dense green carpet that almost glowed against the white. A second slice pressed on top, the sandwich cut into 4 neat triangles on a paper doily. A department store clerk on her lunch break, a teacher on a 40-minute window, a Saturday shopper into the city. All of them could order one and feel the day had been a small occasion. The watercress trade was supplied by a handful of farms, and as those farms shrank, the sandwich shrank with them. The tea sandwich tradition is mostly gone now, and watercress with butter went with it. Number 16. Selling the raw cream skimmed off the morning milk. Every milk cow in the hollow gave more than one family could drink, so the thick yellow cream got skimmed, churned, or carried down the road to a neighbor or a relative across the county line. It never saw a pasteurizer in its life, and that was the whole point. Here is why that jar of homemade cream could never be sold today. In August of 1987, the Food and Drug Administration finalized a regulation, codified at 21 CFR 1240.61, requiring that all milk and milk products in final packaged form be pasteurized before they cross state lines for human consumption. The agency had spent years tracking outbreaks tied to raw milk and concluded that pasteurizing was the only reliable way to make it safe. So the unpasteurized cream that the hook of this list promised, the kind the Hill Country Kitchen ran on, is now barred from interstate sale by federal law. A neighborly swap across the county line is no longer a neighborly thing at all. By the way, real quick before we keep counting down, if your own people cook this way and you want to keep a few of these old Hill Country dishes alive in your own kitchen, we have pulled the safe, legal versions together into a vintage recipe guide. There is a link waiting for you down in the description. Now, back to the list. Coca-Cola once had a secret ingredient that no one dared talk about: coca leaf extract. For decades, tiny traces of it gave the drink its signature kick, a stimulant wrapped in sweetness. By the 1950s, that secret had become a liability. The Food and Drug Administration began tightening regulations around narcotics and stimulants, forcing Coca-Cola to quietly reformulate without ever admitting what changed. Rumors swirled that the beloved drink was being cleaned up, and fans noticed the taste shift almost overnight. The company insisted nothing had changed, but the ban on coca leaf extracts told a different story. It was part of a broader cultural reckoning with drugs and morality, where pleasure, even in small doses, was treated as a threat. By the end of the decade, Coca-Cola was as American as ever, but its wild edge was gone. The new formula kept people refreshed, but not quite as awake. Number 14. The relish tray. Before the word charcuterie showed up in American backyards, there was the relish tray. It was a divided glass dish, sometimes crystal, sometimes pressed glass from Woolworths with 4 or 5 compartments, and you filled each one. Black olives in one, sweet gherkins in another, green olives stuffed with pimento, celery sticks standing upright, carrot curls soaked in ice water until they tightened. Some women added radish roses carved with a paring knife. The tray was the first thing set down and the last thing emptied. It was not a side dish. It was a signal that someone had taken the time to arrange, to prepare, to make the afternoon feel worth showing up for. What the store shelf replaced. In 1950, most of the food at a 4th of July cookout came from somewhere close. The pickles came from the basement shelf. The relish came from last September's garden. The potato salad came from a recipe your mother memorized before she could drive. The chicken came from a butcher who knew your name. But by the end of the decade, the convenience aisle at the new supermarket had a version of everything: jarred relish, bottled barbecue sauce, canned baked beans with a label designed to look homemade. Year by year, the foods on this list started to disappear, not because people stopped wanting them, because the effort stopped feeling worth it when a shortcut sat right there on the shelf. The cookout did not die all at once. It was replaced one jar at a time. Your grandmother didn't throw away the chicken feet. She set them aside, rinsed them under cold water, scored the joints with a paring knife, and dropped them into the stock pot alongside the back and neck. Chicken feet were given away free at butcher shops through most of the 1940s and 50s. No sale value in the new supermarket era, no visual appeal for a generation raised on clean white packaging. But the women who'd always used them knew something. Packaged broth companies didn't advertise. Feet were almost entirely collagen, and slow-simmered 3 or 4 hours, they turned plain water into a golden stock that set up like Jell-O overnight. That shiver of gel in the cold pot was the mark of something real. Today, those same feet run $3 to $5 a pound in Asian markets. The women who got them for nothing left no recipe. They left the knowledge, which isn't the same thing. Number 26, candied apples. A wooden stick, a firm apple, and a pot of boiling red sugar. You dipped the apple, turned it twice, and set it on greased parchment to cool. The shell hardened in minutes. County fairs sold them on every corner, but the homemade ones tasted different. You could taste the apple through the sugar because the coating was thinner, not the inch-thick armor the fairground version came wrapped in. Kids ate them on the porch because mothers refused to let red sugar near the carpet. The juice ran down your chin and the shell cracked against your teeth, and you kept going anyway. By the early 1960s, commercially made versions started appearing in grocery stores sealed in plastic, and the kitchen counter version slowly disappeared. Number 26. Bean soup with a ham bone. After a Sunday ham dinner, the bone went into a stock pot with dried navy beans, a chopped onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. You let it simmer for hours. The marrow dissolved into the broth. The beans softened until they split apart. By Monday evening, you had a pot of soup thick enough to hold a spoon upright, and it tasted like the ham dinner all over again, only richer. This was the original zero-waste cooking. The bone that most people today would throw away was the foundation of an entire second meal. A pound of dried beans cost pennies, the onion cost less, and the bone was already paid for. In the 1950s, a quarter had weight. It could buy a loaf of bread, a quart of milk, or a pound of ground beef depending on where you lived and what day it was. A dinner built around that coin was not an act of desperation. It was an act of arithmetic. Mothers and grandmothers ran their kitchens like accountants, stretching every cut of meat, every bag of flour, every last spoonful of drippings saved in a coffee can beside the stove. The meals on this list came from that discipline. They were not creative cooking the way food magazines later defined it. They were survival made into craft, practiced so often that the measurements lived in muscle memory and the results never varied by more than a pinch. Number 22, Welsh rarebit. The name sounds fancy. It is melted cheese on toast. You made a sauce by melting sharp cheddar with a splash of beer or milk, a pinch of dry mustard, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce. Then you poured it over thick slices of toasted bread and ate it with a fork. The name comes from old British humor, a joke about being too poor to hunt rabbit, so you ate cheese instead. American diners picked it up in the early 1900s, and it stayed on menus through the 1950s. By the 1970s, it was gone. People forgot the name, and without the name, nobody looked for the recipe. It was better than it sounds, and it deserves a second chance. Number 20, cutting flour with potato starch. When flour was expensive or hard to get, you boiled potatoes, mashed them smooth, and mixed the starchy paste right into your bread dough. The potato kept the bread moist longer, gave it a softer crumb, and stretched your flour supply by a third. You could do the same thing with biscuits and rolls. Amish bakers knew that a loaf made with potato held up for days without going stale, while a loaf made with flour alone started drying out by the second morning. It was not a compromise. The bread was better. Some Amish bakers added mashed potato to every loaf they made, not because they had to, but because the result was worth the extra step. Number 18, pot roast. A whole beef chuck, sometimes 8 or 10 pounds of it, rubbed with salt and pepper and browned in a heavy roasting pan until the outside sealed, then cooked low and slow in the oven with onions halved and whatever root vegetables the supply wagon brought that week. By supper, the meat carved with a spoon and fell apart if you looked at it wrong. The pan juices became the gravy without any thickening needed because the long cook drew out all the gelatin from the connective tissue. A cook who could time a pot roast so it finished exactly when the supper bell rang had earned his place in the camp for good. The leftovers became next morning's hash, which meant one roast fed the crew twice and nobody ate the same plate. The supply wagon came once a week in summer and once every 2 weeks in winter if the roads held. Everything a cook needed to produce 40 or 50 meals a day had to be on that wagon or it did not exist. Flour, salt, sugar, lard, beans, coffee, canned milk, salt pork, whatever beef the nearest town could spare. There was no backup plan. No running to a store at midnight. A cook learned to plan 7 days ahead with no room for error and no substitutions. That constraint built meals that were simple, not because the cook lacked skill, but because he lacked options. And somehow those meals tasted better than anything a man could buy in town on payday. Number 24. Liver and onions. You either loved this meal or you sat at the table until bedtime staring at it. Calves' liver sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried in bacon drippings until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed pink. The onions went in first, cooked low and slow until they turned golden and sweet, then piled on top of the liver like a blanket. Mothers served this once a week because liver was cheap and the doctor said it was good for your blood. Children pushed it around the plate. Fathers ate it without complaint. And grandmothers made it better than anyone because they knew the secret was not overcooking it. The moment liver went gray and tough, the meal was ruined. A good cook pulled it from the skillet while it still had give. Served with mashed potatoes and a glass of milk, this was a dinner that tasted like iron and obligation, and something close to love. Before we continue, for those of you who want these kinds of old recipes all collected in one place, I put together something called the Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. That is the last you will hear of it. If it sounds like something you would use, it is right there. Now back to the list. Number 21. Grilled pineapple rings from the can. Your father opened a flat can of Dole pineapple slices, drained the juice into a glass he would drink later, and laid the rings directly on the grate next to whatever meat was already cooking. The sugar caramelized in about 2 minutes per side, and the char lines turned them into something that tasted like they came from a different kitchen entirely. He served them right on top of the hamburger steak or the pork chop, and the sweetness cut through the smoke in a way nothing else on that grill could match. Nobody called it a garnish. It was just pineapple from a can that happened to taste twice as good when it touched a hot grate. Every grocery store in the country carried those flat cans, and most pantries had at least 2 stacked behind the soup. The backyard grill was the only kitchen your father ever claimed. Inside the house, cooking belonged to your mother. She planned the meals, clipped the coupons, stretched the grocery money across the week. But once that charcoal was lit, something shifted. He stood out there with a pair of tongs and a can of beer, and for one evening, he was the one feeding everyone. Nobody talked about it that way. He would have laughed if you called him a cook. But he chose the meat. He built the fire. He decided when it was done. And when he handed you a plate with a pork chop and a pile of beans and a piece of corn with butter running down the side, he had done something that mattered to him in a way he never could have explained, even if you had asked. In the 1950s, the average housewife spent 2 to 3 hours a day preparing meals from raw ingredients, peeling, chopping, simmering, baking. And every bit of it was dismissed as drudgery the moment convenience food hit the shelves. Frozen dinners, boxed mixes, and canned soups promised liberation from the kitchen, and by the 1970s, most American families had traded homemade for heat and serve. Harvard researchers have since connected the rise of ultra-processed food to higher rates of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. She did not have a nutrition degree. She had a sharp knife, a cutting board, and the understanding that a roasted chicken, a pot of rice, and green beans from the garden made a complete meal without a single ingredient she could not pronounce. The food industry sold speed as freedom, and it cost us our health. She was not trapped in that kitchen. She was feeding people real food. Number 25. Sugar bread. A girl in eastern Tennessee, around 1954, came home from school and found nothing in the kitchen except a loaf of white bread, a tin of lard, and a bag of sugar. She was 9 years old. She spread the lard across 2 slices, spooned sugar on top, and pressed them together. That was her after-school snack every day for 2 years. It cost less than 2 cents. A loaf of white bread ran about 14 cents in 1954. The lard was practically free if your family rendered its own. The sugar was a few pennies scooped from the bin. It was not a recipe. It was not a treat. It was what you ate when there was nothing else. Families across Appalachia and the rural South knew this combination by heart. Some used butter when they could afford it. Most could not. The lard gave it richness. The sugar gave it sweetness. The bread gave it substance. Children did not know they were eating poverty. Your grandmother probably made this at some point. She just never told you because she remembered what it meant to need it. Number 14. Veal cutlet with brown gravy. Pounded thin and dusted with seasoned flour, the veal was fried in a skillet until the crust went golden. The gravy came from the pan drippings, a splash of beef stock, and a little flour to thicken it up. The cutlet sat on a plate with mashed potatoes on one side and green beans on the other, and the gravy went over everything. This looked like Sunday dinner at home, and it cost about 35 cents at most automats in the mid-1950s. The veal was always cut thin, which meant it cooked fast and stayed tender, and the breading gave it enough structure to hold up under all that gravy. Horn and Hard Art offered this as one of their premium plates, the kind that rotated through the compartments once or twice a week rather than every day. The regulars knew exactly which days it showed up. They would walk in, check the wall, and if the veal cutlet was sitting there behind the glass, nothing else mattered. Veal started falling out of fashion in the 1970s as prices climbed and tastes changed, but the automat version had already disappeared by then. The fast food chains that replaced the automats had no use for a breaded veal cutlet. It needed a plate, it needed gravy, it needed a knife and fork. Everything about it was incompatible with a paper wrapper and a drive-through window. So it simply went away, and a whole generation of people who grew up eating veal cutlets at the automat never found anything to replace it. Number 24. Leverwurst on rye with raw onion. The smell hit you before you saw the plate, like wet leather and pepper, and the bite of raw onion came right behind. Boar's Head sliced the loaf thick at every Liggett's drugstore in Brooklyn through the 50s. The counterman layered it on seeded rye with a sharp ring of yellow onion, a smear of brown mustard, and a single dill spear set off to the side. The sandwich was loud. The onion bit. The mustard cut through. The liverwurst itself was soft, a dusky pink paste of pork liver and fat that the immigrant butchers in Yorkville had been making for 30 years before it ever reached the rail. You could eat one standing up in 4 minutes and walk back to the shop full of it. But the kids would not eat organ meats anymore by 1975. The doctors were warning about cholesterol. By 2024, Boar's Head stopped making liverwurst entirely. There was a generation of countercooks who could trim a liverwurst loaf in their sleep, and there is no one left now to teach the next one how. Number 18. Selling jars of home-canned green beans at the roadside. A hill country woman who put up 200 quarts in August thought nothing of setting a few jars on a table by the road or trading them at the country store. Green beans, corn, and stewed meat in mason jars were currency in a cash-poor country. Today, that simple sale is shut down cold, and the reason is deadly serious. Low-acid foods like green beans, corn, and any kind of meat create the perfect dark, airless home for the spores that cause botulism, one of the rare poisonings that can actually kill you. The bacteria only stay dormant when the acidity drops to a pH of 4.6 or below, and home green beans sit far above that line. So while a jar of pickles or jam can still be sold under most cottage food laws, low-acid canned goods are flatly excluded because they demand a pressure canning process the state will not certify in a home kitchen. The roadside bean stand that once helped pay the light bill is now against the rules. Tinned sardines in cottonseed oil were once a cheap, portable miracle. They were packed into every pantry, lunchbox, and survival kit, an emblem of convenience before fast food even had a name. But as reports of rancid oils and contamination grew, trust in the humble tin began to rot too. The cottonseed oil, cheap and abundant, proved unstable under heat and storage. The fish took on strange flavors, and entire batches spoiled before they could be sold. When testing revealed toxins forming in the oil itself, the Food and Drug Administration stepped in. Imports were seized, and domestic producers quietly switched to safer oils like olive and soybean. For the first time, Americans began to question the safety of canned goods once seen as untouchable. The sardine, a war hero and working-class staple, suddenly became suspect. And as the tins vanished from shelves, so too did a little of the trust that had built the post-war convenience boom. Number 15, cocktail wieners in grape jelly sauce. This is the one I cannot explain to anyone under 50 because the reaction is always the same. Grape jelly and hot dogs. But it worked. You took a jar of Welch's grape jelly, a bottle of Heinz chili sauce, dumped them into a saucepan, stirred until they melted together, and dropped in 2 packages of those miniature cocktail franks, the stubby little sausages that came packed tight in a sleeve. You simmered it all on low heat for an hour until the sauce turned glossy and dark, somewhere between purple and brown, sweet and tangy, with enough pepper from the chili sauce to keep it honest. Then you poured everything into a chafing dish with a sterno can underneath to keep it warm and set it on the card table with a cup of toothpicks. People stood around that dish all afternoon. You stabbed one wiener, ate it, and went back for another before you finished chewing the first. I have watched grown men eat 30 of them without pulling up a chair. The recipe probably came from a Heinz advertisement in Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal, one of those sponsored recipe cards that food companies slipped into every issue. Whoever wrote it understood something about flavor that the modern food world has overcomplicated. Sweet, salty, smoky, and acidic, all at once in a bite the size of your thumb. No plate, no fork, no napkin. It was built for standing in somebody's backyard, talking with your mouth full, reaching for the next one with a toothpick already sticky from the last. Today, people serve meatballs from a slow cooker and call it a party appetizer. They have never seen what a cocktail frank and grape jelly could do to a crowd on the 4th of July. Before the railroad moved inland in the 1860s, oysters were working-class food, cheap, abundant, and sometimes free. New York State alone grew hundreds of millions of them annually in the decade after the Civil War, and bars along the waterfront gave them away beside a beer just to bring men through the door. Wheelbarrow vendors pushed through city streets selling them by the dozen for pennies. By the 1950s, the great coastal beds had been devastated by industrial pollution, but in the tidal flats of the Chesapeake and the low country shores of South Carolina, families who'd always harvested their own still waded out at low tide with a wire basket and came back with enough for supper. The oyster's reputation had already begun its long shift toward occasion. A raw bar tab today runs $16 to $30 a dozen. The shellfish that once fed waterfront neighborhoods for nothing now announces, on a white tablecloth menu, an arrival those wheelbarrow vendors never imagined. Number 22, divinity. Sugar, corn syrup, water, and 2 egg whites beaten to stiff peaks. You boiled the sugar mixture to hardball, poured it in a thin stream into the egg whites while the mixer ran, and watched it transform into a candy so white and so light it looked like a cloud pressed into shape on a plate. Divinity was the most temperamental candy in the American kitchen. Humidity killed it. If the air was damp, the candy refused to set. Women in the South checked the weather before starting a batch, and on rainy days they made something else entirely. There was no saving a failed batch. It either worked or you threw the whole bowl out and tried again the following week. A divinity without a pecan half sitting on top was considered unfinished, like a letter without a signature. Church women across the deep South made hundreds of pieces every Christmas, lined up on wax paper across every flat surface in the house. The best divinity had a texture between marshmallow and meringue, dry on the outside and slightly chewy at the center. When divinity was right, nothing else on the candy plate mattered. Number 29. Sloppy Joes. Ground beef browned with onion, then stirred together with ketchup, a little mustard, Worcestershire sauce, and brown sugar until the mixture turned thick and sweet and tangy. You spooned it onto a soft hamburger bun and ate it with both hands. The name was honest. There was no clean way to eat one. Children loved them because they were messy and sweet. Parents loved them because a pound of beef and a bottle of ketchup produced enough filling for the whole family. School cafeterias served them by the hundreds. Church fellowship halls put them out on steam tables. In the 1950s, sloppy joes were everywhere, and the only rule was that the bun had to be soft enough to absorb the sauce without falling apart. Before I go any further, for the folks who want more of these old recipes gathered in one place, I put together a collection called the Vintage Recipe Guide. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now back to the list. Number 26, bread and milk supper. This was what you ate when there was nothing else in the house. You broke up a few slices of bread into a bowl, poured cold or warm milk over it, and sometimes added a spoonful of sugar. There was no cooking involved. There was no recipe to follow. It was the last line of defense between eating and not eating, and millions of Americans grew up on it during lean weeks. Some people remember it fondly, the way the bread went soft and the milk turned sweet. Others remember it as the meal that meant the money had run out. It disappeared not because people forgot how, but because they chose to leave it behind. Number 16, saving bacon drippings as everyday cooking fat. Every time you fried bacon, you poured the hot grease through a small strainer into a jar that sat on the back of the stove. That jar never emptied because you added to it every week. You used that fat to fry eggs, season cast iron, grease a baking pan, start a pot of beans, or sear a pork chop. It added a smoky richness to everything it touched. Amish kitchens did not have bottles of olive oil or spray cans of cooking lubricant. They had a jar of bacon grease, and it did the job better than anything you could buy. That jar was never empty and never clean, and everything that came out of the skillet tasted like it had been loved. There was a time when a family could feed itself from what it grew, raised, preserved, and stored. Then the grocery store showed up and made everything faster. Canned goods replaced home canning. Vegetable oil replaced lard. Store-bought yeast replaced sourdough starters that had been alive for years. Nobody forced anyone to stop. It just got easier to buy than to make. And one by one, the skills disappeared. Not because they stopped working, but because people stopped needing them. The irony is that most of what the Amish were doing in the 1950s is exactly what people today are paying good money to relearn. Fermenting, curing, preserving, stretching ingredients. The techniques never became obsolete. We just forgot we knew them. Number 21, fried salt pork and potatoes. Salt pork was the cheapest protein a camp could buy in bulk. It came in barrels and kept for months without refrigeration. The cook sliced it thin, fried it crisp in its own fat, then cooked sliced potatoes in the rendered grease until they turned golden and slightly translucent. That was the whole meal. Sometimes a raw onion sliced on the side for sharpness. The salt from the pork seasoned everything it touched, and the fat gave the potatoes a richness that butter alone could never achieve. This was a supper a man could eat in 5 minutes flat and feel full for the rest of the night. Number 17, stuffed green peppers. You cut the tops off, scooped out the seeds, and filled each pepper with a mixture of ground beef, cooked rice, diced onion, and canned tomato sauce. Then you stood them upright in a baking dish, poured more tomato sauce around the base, and baked them for about 45 minutes until the peppers softened and the filling firmed up. The kitchen smelled like a church supper. Every pepper was its own self-contained dinner, neat and round and sitting in a pool of red sauce. Families in Ohio and Pennsylvania made these almost weekly because 1 pound of hamburger stretched across 6 peppers and fed the whole table. You did not need a side dish. The pepper was the bowl and the meal was inside it. Leftovers went into the refrigerator standing up, and the next day you reheated them in the oven, and they tasted even better because the rice had soaked up all the sauce overnight. Number 16, warm potato salad with bacon drippings. This was not the cold mayonnaise version from the deli counter. Your father kept a cast iron skillet on the side grate while the meat cooked, and when the bacon was done, he crumbled it over a bowl of warm sliced red potatoes, then poured the hot drippings right on top along with chopped onion, a splash of cider vinegar, salt, and a pinch of sugar. The whole thing came together while the coals were still glowing. By the time the ribs were ready, the potatoes had soaked up the fat and the vinegar and turned into something rich and tangy that no cold deli version could touch. He made it the same way every time, standing at the grill with tongs in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. Every family in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana had a version. The German families called it Kartoffelsalat. Everyone else just called it the good potato salad. She never called it bone broth. She called it stock or soup base or just the pot on the back burner. Chicken carcasses, beef knuckles, vegetable trimmings that would have gone to waste. All of it went into a heavy pot with cold water and a splash of vinegar, then simmered for the better part of a day. The vinegar was the secret. It pulled calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus out of the bones and into the liquid, and she learned that trick from her own mother without ever knowing the chemistry behind it. Modern nutritional research confirms that roughly 70% of the immune system is housed in the gut, and collagen-rich broth supports the intestinal lining that keeps it working. What sells for $9 a carton at the health food store cost her nothing, just time, scraps, and patience. The kitchen smelled like warmth itself when that pot was going. Today, you can buy bone broth powder in a pouch. It is not the same thing. Number 13, bread pudding. Stale bread was never thrown away in the 1950s, not by anyone who had lived through the Depression. You tore it into pieces, soaked it in milk and egg, added sugar and a pinch of cinnamon, and baked it until it puffed up golden and warm. A pan of bread pudding cost about 8 cents and fed a family of 4. The bread was free because it was leftover. The egg was 5 cents. The milk was a few pennies from the bottle on the porch. In New Orleans, bread pudding was already a famous dessert served in restaurants with whiskey sauce poured on top. In the rest of the country, it was survival food dressed up as something sweet. The bread absorbed the custard and turned soft. The top got crispy. If you had raisins, you added those. If you did not, it was still good. Every piece of stale bread had a second life in this dish. That was the rule in every kitchen that had known hard times. You used what you had, and you made it count. Number 23, Harvard beets. Sliced beets in a sweet and sour sauce made from sugar, vinegar, cornstarch, and a little butter. Nobody ever proved the name was connected to the university, though people argued about it for decades. What mattered was that automats served this as a hot plate, and people ordered it as a full lunch with a roll and a cup of coffee. The beets came out of the compartment already glistening, deep red and sticky, and the smell hit you before the door was all the way open. You either loved Harvard beets or you pushed the plate away. There was no middle ground. The sauce alone took about 20 minutes to make properly, and the kitchen crew kept fresh batches rotating through the compartments all afternoon. Today, you would be hard-pressed to find Harvard beets on any menu in the country, and most people under 50 have never even heard of them. Number 12, pimento cheese on rye. At Augusta National in 1947, a couple named the Herndons sold pimento cheese sandwiches on the course for 25 cents apiece, and the recipe spread from there to every drugstore counter in the South within a decade. The mix was sharp cheddar, grated coarse, jarred pimentos drained and chopped, mayonnaise, a pinch of cayenne, and black pepper, all stirred until the orange paste held together but still showed the red flecks. You ate it on rye, white, or pumpernickel, cold, with a sweet pickle and a glass of sweet tea. A Walgreens in Atlanta listed pimento cheese on rye for 30 cents in 1955. A Liggett's in Charlotte ran a Saturday special at 20. The pimento cheese sandwich has held on better than most on this list. Even so, the drugstore counter version is gone. The lunch counters that built their reputation on this sandwich were inside Woolworth stores that desegregated in 1960 after 4 students sat down and refused to leave for 5 months running. The counters kept their stools through 1993 and then closed for good. The sandwich outlived the counter that made it famous, which is the strangest small monument the food world has. Number 21, simmering supper in the old lead-glazed crockery. Those heavy redware crocks and bean pots, glazed to a deep honey shine, were the pride of many a hill kitchen and got handed down like heirlooms. Cooks slow-cooked pinto beans in them, soured kraut in them, and stored buttermilk and stewed tomatoes in them for days. The trouble lives in the glaze. When that old pottery was fired at too low or too uneven a heat, the lead never fully bonded into the glass surface, and it leaches straight into the food. Acidic dishes pull it out fastest, which means the very beans, kraut, and tomatoes those crocks were made for were the worst offenders. The Food and Drug Administration now warns flatly against cooking, serving, or storing food in any pottery that tests for leachable lead, and a single family in New York was poisoned this way as recently as the last few years. That cherished bean pot is now a hazard the agency tells you to retire. Shellfish cocktails from street vendors were the taste of coastal summer. Iced oysters and clams scooped into paper cups and doused with lemon and spice. They were cheap, lively and social, eaten standing up with friends under the sun. But as hepatitis outbreaks swept through seaside towns, health boards declared war on raw shellfish. Vendors were shut down, and beachside stalls were emptied overnight. Scientists blamed warm weather, poor storage, and lack of regulation. But for locals, it felt like losing a ritual. The ocean's bounty was now something to fear, not savor. People began boiling, frying, and sterilizing what they once ate fresh. Those carefree days of slurping briny cocktails from paper cups were gone, replaced by strict hygiene codes and refrigerated displays. Safety came at the cost of spontaneity. America's love for the sea stayed, but its trust in street-side seafood never recovered. Number 19, Chow Chow Relish. If you grew up in the South or the foothills of Appalachia, you knew chow chow. It was a cooked relish made from the end of the garden, whatever was left come September. Green tomatoes, cabbage, onions, bell peppers, all chopped fine and simmered in vinegar with mustard seed, celery seed, and turmeric until the kitchen smelled sharp enough to water your eyes. Your grandmother canned it in half-pint jars and carried one to the cookout in a paper sack. You spooned it over hot dogs, burgers, pinto beans, anything that needed a vinegar bite to cut the grease. When Heinz and Vlasic put sweet pickle relish in every grocery store, chow chow lost its seat at the table. Ramps came up the same 2 weeks every April in the wet creek hollows where the soil never fully dried. They smelled before you found them, wild, garlicky, unmistakable. In West Virginia, where the state encyclopedia documents ramps as a traditional food going back to the first Appalachian settlers who learned them from the Iroquois, Cherokee, and Shawnee already there, a family that knew a good patch guarded that knowledge like a deed. You dug carefully, leaving enough bulbs so the patch returned. You brought home a grocery bag full and the house smelled like the holler for 3 days. Ramps fried in bacon fat with eggs and cornbread was breakfast. Eaten raw with salt, juice on your chin was just how you did it. Appalachian schools sent ramp-eating children home, not as punishment, but as a practical matter of classroom air. Today, urban markets list them at $15 to $20 a pound. The patch in the hollow is still there. Fewer families know it every spring. Number 25. Butterscotch drops. Brown sugar, butter, a splash of vinegar, and just enough water to dissolve it all. You stirred the pot over medium heat until the mixture hit hard crack, then dropped spoonfuls onto a greased baking sheet and stepped back. Each one cooled into a small golden disc that cracked clean between your teeth. The vinegar cut through the sweetness and gave every piece a sharp little edge underneath all that butter. Some women scored the drops while they were still warm, so they snapped into even pieces. Others let the spoon decide the shape and never thought twice about it. These were the candies that lived at the bottom of your grandmother's handbag, each one wrapped in cellophane that fused to the surface, no matter how carefully she twisted the ends. Nobody bought them at a store. They came from the kitchen, they tasted like the kitchen, and everybody just called them butterscotch. A kitchen in the 1950s became a candy factory every December. The same woman who fried chicken on Sunday was pulling taffy on Tuesday and dipping bonbons on Thursday. She never bought a single piece of candy for the holiday tins she packed and delivered to every neighbor, every teacher, every church secretary on the list. The candy you gave to people you cared about came from your own stove. It cost almost nothing except time, and time was the one thing she gave without counting. Number 25. Stewed tomatoes on toast. A can of whole tomatoes poured into a saucepan with a spoonful of butter, a pinch of sugar, and salt. You let them simmer until they broke apart into a thick, chunky sauce, then spooned them over slices of toasted bread. The toast soaked up the juice and turned soft underneath, while the edges stayed firm enough to hold. This was a supper that Catholic families made on Fridays, and penny-pinching households made any night the meat ran out. Some cooks stirred in a beaten egg at the end to stretch it further. Others tore the bread into pieces and let it cook right in the pot. It looked like nothing on the plate, but it tasted like a garden in August, and it cost so little that nobody ever thought to write the recipe down. 23. Tuna noodle casserole. A can of tuna, a can of cream of mushroom soup, a bag of egg noodles, and a handful of crushed potato chips on top. You mixed the first three together, poured it into a baking dish, covered it with the chips, and baked it until it bubbled. This was one of the most common casseroles in mid-century America, and for good reason. It used shelf-stable ingredients that most families already had on hand. The potato chip crust gave it a crunch that made the whole thing feel deliberate instead of improvised. Church cookbooks across the country printed dozens of versions, but somewhere around the 1980s, tuna casserole became a punchline, and people stopped making it. Number 22. Drying herbs in sealing bundles. You cut your sage, thyme, rosemary, and dill right before the flowers opened, when the oils were strongest. You tied them in small bunches with kitchen twine and hung them upside down from a nail in the pantry ceiling or from the rafters of a covered porch. Warm air rose and dried them slowly over a week or two. Once they crumbled between your fingers, you stripped the leaves and stored them in small jars. No dehydrator, no oven, no electricity at all. Just air and gravity. Those dried herbs kept their flavor for a full year if you stored them out of the light. One summer afternoon of cutting and tying gave you a full winter of seasoning without spending a cent. Number 26. Camp hash. Leftover roast from the night before got chopped fine with a cleaver on the butcher block, mixed with diced potatoes and onion, pressed flat into the biggest skillet in the kitchen, and fried hard in lard until the bottom turned into a dark crust you could tap with a fork and hear it ring. The cook flipped the whole thing like a giant pancake. If it held together, the crew cheered. If it broke apart, nobody cared because it tasted the same either way. Hash was the Monday morning meal in most camps because Sunday supper always left behind enough meat to fill the pan. It was the cook's way of saying nothing goes to waste in this kitchen. Number 13. Ring bologna dinner. The butcher sold it in a horseshoe-shaped loop, and you brought it home and sliced it into thick rounds. You browned the slices in a skillet until the edges curled and crisped, then served them alongside boiled potatoes and sauerkraut from a jar. In the upper Midwest and parts of Pennsylvania, this was a standard Tuesday night. The bologna had more flavor than a hot dog and cost about the same. Some families simmered the whole ring in a pot of water with potatoes and cabbage, like a poor man's version of a boiled dinner. Others fried the slices and served them with baked beans. Either way, it was a meal built around a piece of processed meat that most grocery stores still carry today, but almost nobody thinks of as dinner anymore. Number 23. Barbecued chicken halves with vinegar mop. Your father split a whole bird down the backbone with kitchen shears, pressed it flat, and laid both halves bone side down on the grate. Then he stood there for the better part of an hour with a cotton rag tied to a stick, dipping it into a bowl of vinegar, ketchup, and Worcestershire, mopping the chicken every time the sauce dried. The fire could not be too hot, or the sugar in the ketchup burned black. This was the dish that separated the patient dads from the impatient ones. The ones who got it right served chicken with a mahogany glaze that crackled at the edges and stayed juicy against the bone. The ones who rushed it served something charred on the outside and raw near the joint. Nobody taught him the technique. He watched his own father do it one summer and never forgot. If the vinegar cleaned the surfaces, the morning air cleaned the rooms themselves, and that habit started before the sun was fully up. The very first thing she did after making coffee was walk through the house and crack every window, even in January if the cold was bearable. She called it airing out. The Environmental Protection Agency would later determine that indoor air carries 2 to 5 times more pollutants than outdoor air, trapped by insulation, synthetic carpets, and cleaning product residue. Cross-ventilation, windows open on opposite sides to create a draft, flushes those contaminants in minutes. She did not know the word off-gassing. She just knew a closed-up house smelled stale, and stale meant something was wrong. 15 minutes of open windows on a cool morning did what no air purifier can fully replicate. Number 21. Dandelion greens. In the spring of 1952, children in the hollows of West Virginia went out with paper sacks before school and picked dandelion greens from the fields. They filled those bags until the paper was damp and heavy. Their mothers washed the greens in cold water, wilted them in a skillet with bacon grease and a splash of vinegar, and served them alongside whatever else was on the table. The greens cost nothing, not a single cent. They grew everywhere. During the Depression, people had picked dandelions so aggressively that at peak season you could not find a single plant in some neighborhoods. They were eaten as fast as they appeared. By the 1950s, the habit had not died. Poor families still knew that those yellow flowers in the yard were not weeds. They were food, good food. The greens were packed with iron and vitamins at a time when most poor families could not afford fresh vegetables from a store. A head of lettuce at the grocery cost 20 cents. Your yard was your garden. You just had to know what to look for. Number 25. Tomato rice soup. This sat in the soup section of every Horn and Hardart automat from the 1930s straight through the 1960s. A big bowl of stewed tomatoes, long grain rice, a little celery, and enough salt to make you forget it cost a dime. The rice was always cooked separately and added right before serving so it would not turn to mush, and that is a detail you will not find at any chain restaurant today. The broth had a sweetness from the tomatoes that balanced the salt, and it tasted better the longer it sat in those warm compartments behind the glass. It was the meal you bought when you had almost nothing in your pocket but still wanted something warm and filling. Office clerks, cab drivers, shop girls coming off their shifts, they all ordered this one, and not one of them would have called it fancy. It was just good. Number 21. Banana mayonnaise on white. The first bite tasted wrong and right in the same instant. Sweet banana, salty mayonnaise, soft white bread. The mayonnaise was Duke's. The bananas were green-tipped, sliced thin, laid in a single overlapping layer. A sprinkle of salted peanuts on top when the jar held some. The sandwich was a Southern staple long before the Depression, like so many of the things this country eats without questioning. The bread was buttered on the outside on hot days to keep the slices from going slimy. The lunch counters that served it widely are gone now. The sandwich is still eaten in pockets across the Deep South. Most never try it. They are missing something honest. Number 17. A mess of poke salad picked from the fence row. In early spring, when the garden was bare, Hill families went out to the field edges and cut the first tender shoots of pokeweed for a green that tasted like a cross between spinach and asparagus. It was free food when there was no other, and a Southern table staple. What few of them said out loud is that the whole plant is genuinely poisonous. Every part of pokeweed carries toxins, heaviest in the root, stem, and leaves. The old method was to boil the young greens, pour off the water, then boil them again in fresh water to leach the poison out. But poison centers across the South still log cases of people who followed that exact method and got violently sick anyway. Health authorities now warn against eating it at all, and you will never see it offered for sale. That free spring green sits one bad boil away from a hospital visit. Irradiated fruit was supposed to be the future. Government scientists promised longer shelf lives, fewer pests, and fresher produce for all. They beamed atomic rays through oranges and apples, calling it the miracle of modern preservation. But when newspapers began calling it nuclear food, the optimism curdled. The same technology that powered bombs was now being used on breakfast tables, and that frightened everyone. Housewives wrote letters to Congress demanding answers. Schools began banning irradiated fruit from cafeterias, and grocery stores quietly cleared their shelves. No matter how many officials said it was safe, people could not shake the image of glowing fruit sitting under the kitchen light. By the end of the decade, the program was halted completely. The fear was stronger than the science, and the atomic age of food ended before it ever truly began. Number 20, barbecued chicken halves. This was not the boneless, skinless breast you throw on a gas grill today. This was a whole chicken, split down the backbone with kitchen shears, pressed flat, and laid bone side down over charcoal so hot it left scorch marks on the concrete underneath. You basted it with a sauce your father made on the kitchen stove, usually ketchup, brown sugar, Worcestershire sauce, and a splash of cider vinegar, and you basted it every 10 minutes with a cotton dish mop your mother never wanted near her kitchen again. The chicken took 45 minutes to an hour. The skin burned in places. The thigh meat near the bone sometimes came out pink, and nobody worried about it. You pulled it apart with your hands, standing over a paper plate balanced on the back steps, and the sauce ran down your wrist and dried sticky in the July sun. The trick was the charcoal. It was never uniform. One side of the grill ran hotter than the other, so you moved the chicken around with your bare hands if you were brave and with a pair of pliers if you were smart. Weber had just started selling their kettle grill around 1952, but most families were still using a homemade rig. Cinder blocks, a steel grate pulled from an old oven, and a bag of Kingsford. That was the whole barbecue. The chicken tasted like smoke and brown sugar, and the last free Saturday before Monday came back. Today it comes pre-marinated in a vacuum bag, and the cinder block grill sits in a landfill somewhere. Brisket was once so unwanted in the beef-loving state of Texas that butchers handed it over free alongside better cuts, practically as an afterthought. The muscles sat at the front of the steer's chest, tough and marbled with collagen, and in an era when most families wanted meat tender right off the fire, brisket seemed to offer nothing. It was too thick to pan-fry and demanded 8 hours of low-oven heat that most households didn't want to spend. The families who knew what to do with it, usually those who'd been stretching lesser cuts for generations, laid it fat side down in a sealed Dutch oven with onions and a little salt and left it alone. What came out bore no resemblance to what went in. Long, dark, mahogany ribbons of meat so collagen-rich they melted against the tongue. Today, the same cut runs $15 a pound, and celebrated Texas pitmasters charge $30 for a half-pound plate. The cut nobody wanted has become the cut everyone competes over, which would have baffled the woman who first understood what patience could do to it. Number 29, cream cheese mince. Cream cheese, powdered sugar, and a drop of peppermint oil. You mixed the dough by hand until it was smooth enough to press into small rubber molds shaped like roses, leaves, and bells. Each mint came out soft, pale, and light enough to dissolve on contact with your tongue. Bridal showers, baby showers, church receptions, every white tablecloth in the 1950s had a plate of these next to the punch bowl. The cream cheese gave them a tang that plain sugar mints never had, and pastel food coloring made them look like porcelain buttons lined up in rows. Women kept their mint molds in kitchen drawers for decades, pulling them out whenever someone in the family got married or the church ladies needed a tray for Sunday fellowship. You could press out 100 in half an hour. No cooking, no thermometer, no cleanup worth mentioning. They melted on the tongue before you finished chewing, and every woman at the table asked for the recipe even though she already had it. Before I go any further, for the folks who love making old recipes like these from scratch, I put together a collection of recipes like these in one place. It is called the Vintage Recipe Guide, and you can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not mention it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 28. Egg noodles with butter and black pepper. A pot of water, a handful of wide egg noodles, a pat of butter, and a few cracks of pepper. That was the whole dinner on nights when the grocery money ran out before the week did. Some mothers stirred in a spoonful of cottage cheese or a splash of canned milk to make it feel richer. Others cracked an egg into the hot noodles and let the heat cook it through. It was bland by restaurant standards and perfect by the standards of anyone who had been on their feet since dawn. The children ate it without argument because it was soft and warm. Parents reached for it because the cupboard could always produce it. Number 27, fried bologna sandwiches. You took a thick slice of bologna, cut a slit in the edge so it would not curl up, and fried it in a hot skillet until the edges went crispy and brown. Then you put it on white bread with mustard, maybe a slice of American cheese if you had it. That was lunch. That was the whole evening meal on some nights too. Bologna was one of the cheapest proteins you could buy, and frying it changed the texture completely. The outside got caramelized and a little smoky, and the inside stayed soft. It was a blue-collar sandwich that tasted better than it had any right to. You could make it in 3 minutes with one pan and spend barely anything doing it. Number 21, open kettle canning for tomatoes. You brought a big pot of tomatoes to a rolling boil, ladled them straight into sterilized jars, and sealed the lids while everything was still hot. The heat created the vacuum. No water bath, no pressure canner, just the boiling temperature of the food itself. Amish cooks did this with tomatoes, applesauce, and fruit preserves. The acidity of the tomatoes made it safe, and a pinch of salt and a squeeze of lemon juice kept the color bright. A single row of tomato jars in the cellar could carry a family through 6 months of winter soups, stews, and casseroles. You heard that seal pop when you opened one in December, and the kitchen smelled like August. Amish women timed the harvest so they could put up a full year's worth of tomatoes in a single week, working from dawn until the last jar sealed. People today call it meal prep. The Amish called it survival. Every shelf in that pantry was organized by season. The front row held what you needed this week. The back row held what would get you through February. Nothing was random. The jars were filled in order, dated with a grease pencil, and rotated so the oldest got used first. The root cellar below kept potatoes, carrots, turnips, and onions buried in damp sand at a steady temperature all winter long. The smokehouse out back held the meat. The springhouse kept the dairy cold. It was a network, and every part of it depended on the others. When one piece failed, you felt it in your meals for months. That is why these tricks mattered. They were not clever ideas. They were the difference between eating well in January and going hungry. Number 27, boiled beef and potatoes. Nothing fancy about this one. A shoulder or a chuck roast went into the biggest pot in the cookhouse with whole peeled potatoes, salt, and water drawn from the creek. It boiled for hours while the cook did everything else. The meat pulled apart with a fork, and the potatoes soaked up enough beef fat to taste like something far more complicated than they were. Served on a tin plate with a ladle of the cooking broth poured over everything. In camps where fresh vegetables were scarce through winter, this was Tuesday, Thursday, and sometimes Saturday. The men ate it without complaint because they understood the shelves were bare and the cook was doing what he could with what he had. Number 22, American chop suey, elbow macaroni, ground beef, canned tomatoes, and a diced green pepper. That was the whole thing. You browned the beef, added the vegetables, stirred in the cooked noodles, and served it in bowls like pasta with ambition. In New England, they called it American chop suey. In the Midwest, it went by goulash. Down south, it barely had a name at all. The dish had nothing to do with Chinese cooking. The name stuck because anything tossed together fast with whatever you had counted as chop suey in the American imagination of the time. It tasted better the next day, reheated in a skillet with a little extra tomato stirred through. Most families made it once a week and never wrote down the recipe. Number 24, charcoal grilled bratwurst. In the upper Midwest, this was not a sausage. This was a Saturday. Dads bought them in links of 5 or 6 from the butcher counter, and the only preparation was a cold beer to drink while they cooked. The brats went on a medium fire, turned every few minutes with a fork that left 2 small holes in the casing. You ate them in a plain white bun with yellow mustard and nothing else. No ketchup, no relish. That was not up for discussion. The snap of the casing when you bit through was the entire point. Some fathers simmered them in beer and sliced onions first, then finished them over the charcoal for the grill marks. Others kept it simple, just pork, fire, and patience. Before I continue, for those of you who want these kinds of old recipes collected in one place, I put together something called the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is full of the meals your family made when the kitchen was simpler. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not mention it again. If it sounds like something you want, it is right there. Now, back to the countdown. Every kitchen worth remembering had a cast iron skillet so heavy you needed both hands to lift it, and the woman who owned it treated it like an heirloom, because it was. A 1991 study in the Journal of Food Science confirmed what those cooks already suspected. Food prepared in cast iron absorbed measurable amounts of dietary iron, with acidic dishes like applesauce gaining up to 7 milligrams per serving and spaghetti sauce picking up 3 to 5. The seasoning on that skillet, layers of polymerized fat built up over years of daily use, created a natural nonstick surface without a single synthetic chemical. She never washed it with soap. She wiped it clean, rubbed it with a thin coat of lard, and set it back on the stove still warm. Your grandmother did not need a global health recommendation. She needed cornbread for supper and a skillet her mother gave her, and that was enough. Number 15. Tomato soup cake. In 1950, Campbell's printed a recipe on the back of their condensed tomato soup can that changed everything. You took 1 can of tomato soup, mixed it into a standard cake batter in place of most of the liquid, and baked it. The cake came out moist, spiced, and faintly tangy. It cost about 20 cents to make the whole thing. Housewives across America were skeptical at first. Tomato soup in a cake sounded wrong. The soup added moisture and a subtle depth that plain water or milk could not match. By the mid-1950s, it was showing up at church suppers and bake sales from Ohio to Oklahoma. Nobody advertised what was in it. You just brought it, people ate it, and they asked for the recipe. The secret ingredient was not some exotic spice. It was a 10-cent can of soup that every family already had in the cupboard. Number 10. Corned beef on rye. Thick sliced corned beef piled on fresh rye bread with a swipe of brown mustard. No lettuce, no tomato, no nonsense. This was a New York automat sandwich in its purest form. The corned beef was brined and slow-cooked in the back kitchen, sliced by hand, and stacked high enough that you had to press the sandwich down to fit it through the little glass door. A dime's worth of meat between 2 slices of good bread, and it was better than most deli sandwiches you would pay several dollars for today. Automats could sell this cheaply because they cut out the counterman and the wait. You just grabbed it and sat down. The corned beef sandwich disappeared from automats because the meat takes hours to cure and cook, and the entire fast food model runs on minutes. Behind every automat wall was a kitchen full of people you never met. Women who showed up at 4 in the morning to roll pie dough and chop onions. Men who stood over deep fryers for 8-hour shifts without sitting down. They were paid hourly, and many of them stayed for years because the work was steady and the kitchen was clean. Horn and Hardart employed thousands of cooks, bakers, and prep workers across their locations, and a large number of them were Black women who had migrated north from the Carolinas and Virginia looking for stable, dignified work. These were not assembly line jobs. Every plate that went behind a glass door was cooked and arranged by hand. When the automats closed, those jobs disappeared almost overnight, and the people who held them had to start over in an industry that no longer valued what they knew how to do. Number 20. Underwood deviled ham on rye. Peeling back that red foil tin was the sound of a lunchbox opening from 1922 through about 1968. The tin held a paste of finely ground ham, mustard, vinegar, and spices that the William Underwood Company had been selling out of New England since 1868. You scooped 2 tablespoons onto rye, pressed a second slice on top, and cut diagonally. The tin had a small red devil on the label that had not changed in 50 years. It was the oldest registered trademark on a food product in the country. Mothers packed deviled ham sandwiches in metal pails for steel mill shifts and for school because the paste held up through a 6-hour day in any weather. But the kids called it pink mush by the 70s, and the doctors said the salt was too high. The deviled ham sandwich went to ground, and the small red devil on the tin became the only thing about it most Americans remembered. Number 20. Putting up pickles and kraut in a galvanized wash tub. Come harvest, The big zinc-coated tub came down off the porch nail and got pressed into double duty, soaking cucumbers in brine or holding shredded cabbage under a weighted plate until it soured. It was the biggest vessel in the house, so it made sense. The problem is chemistry. Acidic food and zinc do not mix. The brine and the vinegar eat right through the galvanized coating and pull zinc salts into the food, enough to make a family sick. Zinc poisoning brings on cramps and nausea within hours, which is just why inspectors singled the old tubs out. The Federal Food Code, going back to its 1997 edition, states plainly that galvanized metal may not be used for any food contact surface that touches acidic food. That covers exactly what those tubs were used for. So, the all-purpose wash tub that doubled as a pickling crock is now off limits for the job. Red dye number 2 was the color of childhood itself. Bright cherry candies, popsicles, and sweet cereals all gleamed with it. Then the headlines came: scientists warning of cancer links, parents panicking, and lawmakers rushing to respond. The once innocent color became a symbol of everything people feared about synthetic additives. Candy factories were forced to reformulate, and grocery shelves turned duller overnight. The ban was more than a regulation. It was an awakening. Americans realized that even the most cheerful hues could hide danger. For a nation obsessed with convenience and appearance, that was a bitter truth to swallow. Red candies without the familiar glow looked sadder, emptier, somehow less alive. But for many, the risk no longer seemed worth the shine. The ban left behind more than faded sweets. It left behind a lasting suspicion of anything too bright to be real. Number 24. Watermelon rind pickles. Nobody threw away the rind. Your grandmother peeled the green skin off, cut the white part into chunks, and simmered it with cider vinegar, cinnamon sticks, whole cloves, and enough sugar to make your teeth ache. She jarred them in the fall, but she opened them on the 4th because nothing cut through the heaviness of grilled meat like a cold, sweet, vinegar-soaked chunk of rind. The texture was firm, almost like a candied pear, and the spice hit you after the sweetness faded. Every church cookbook in America had a version. Today, most people throw the rind straight into the trash and do not know what they are losing. Before I go any further, for the folks who want more recipes like these all in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is a collection of the kind of cooking you grew up with, the kind nobody writes down anymore. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Every rural road in the South ran past blackberry canes, tangled along fence rows and ditches, heavy from mid-June through July, free to anyone willing to deal with the thorns. You didn't need land. You needed long sleeves, a bucket, and patience. Families picked by the gallon and put most up, jams sealed with paraffin in ball jars, berries in light syrup for winter. But the cobbler was the summer thing. Fruit and sugar simmered in a cast iron skillet, batter poured over, slid into the oven until the top went gold and the berry juice pushed through the cracks. It came to the table still warm, spooned into bowls with canned cream. That cobbler wasn't a recipe so much as a reflex. Something every woman who'd grown up picking could produce without measuring anything, adjusting by the look of the fruit and the feel of the batter. Today, wild blackberries run $6 to $8 a pint at farmers markets. The fence rows are still full of them. Most people drive past without stopping because they didn't grow up knowing that you stopped. Number 28, coconut bonbons, shredded coconut, powdered sugar, sweetened condensed milk, and a few drops of almond extract. You mixed the filling, rolled it into small balls, and set them on wax paper in the refrigerator until they firmed up. Then you dipped each one in melted chocolate with a fork, one at a time. The whole process took an afternoon. The filling was sweet enough to make your teeth ache, and the chocolate shell cracked clean when you bit through it. Women made trays of these for Christmas. Tin boxes lined with wax paper went from kitchen to kitchen through the holidays. They looked like something from a candy shop window, but they cost almost nothing, and every bite was better than store-bought. Number 23. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Homemade biscuits split open on a plate, covered in a thick white gravy made from breakfast sausage, pan drippings, flour, and milk. The gravy was peppery and rich, and the biscuits soaked it up like a sponge. In the rural South, this was dinner as often as it was breakfast. A tube of bulk sausage, a few cups of flour, and some milk gave you enough food to fill a full table for very little money. You browned the sausage, left the grease in the pan, whisked in the flour until it turned golden, then added the milk slowly until it thickened. Every family had their own ratio. None of them wrote it down. Number 29, salmon patties. A can of pink salmon, an egg, some crushed saltine crackers, and a hot skillet with oil. You drained the can, picked out the bones if you were particular, mixed everything together, shaped it into patties, and fried them until they were brown on both sides. Families ate these once a week in some parts of the country, especially on Fridays in Catholic households where meat was off the table. The can was cheap enough to buy every week, and the patties were filling enough to pass for a real dinner. Most people under 40 have never seen one. A squeeze of lemon and a pile of peas on the side, and nobody at that table was complaining. One skillet, 5 minutes, done. Before I go on, this is for the folks who want all of these recipes gathered in one place. I put together the vintage recipe guide with more meals, like the ones you are hearing today. You can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 19, preserving eggs for months without refrigeration. You took fresh eggs, still unwashed so the natural bloom stayed on the shell, and you rubbed each one with a thin coat of mineral oil. That oil sealed the tiny pores in the shell and kept air and bacteria from getting inside. Then you set the eggs point down in a cool, dark place. A cellar shelf worked fine. Those eggs stayed fresh for 3 months, sometimes longer. The key was that you never wash the egg before coating it. A freshly laid egg has an invisible protective layer called the bloom that seals the shell naturally. Washing removes it. The mineral oil replaced what washing would take away, and it did it better because oil does not evaporate. Some families used a different method. They mixed a bucket of water glass, which is a liquid sodium silicate, and submerged the eggs completely. The water glass formed a hard, airtight seal around each shell. Eggs stored this way lasted 6 months or more and came out looking and tasting like they had been laid that week. You cracked one open in February and the yolk stood up tall and bright orange, the same as the day the hen laid it. Either way, the trick was the same. Keep air out and keep the egg cold. Amish families with a flock of laying hens put up dozens of eggs every spring when production was high and pulled from that supply all winter when the hens slowed down. A family with 20 hens could preserve enough eggs in March and April to last until the flock started laying again the following spring. You never bought eggs from a store. You did not need to. The pantry had them, sealed and waiting, row after row in wooden crates that smelled faintly of mineral oil and straw. Number 25, split pea soup. A ham bone and a bag of dried split peas could feed 40 men and still leave enough for tomorrow's lunch. The soup cooked all day on the back of the stove, thick enough to hold a spoon upright by supper time. Chunks of ham fell off the bone and disappeared into the green mass. Black pepper, a bay leaf, and nothing else. Loggers ate it with sourdough bread torn off in chunks and dropped straight into the bowl until the bread turned soft and the soup coated every piece. It was one of the few meals that tasted better the second day, which made it perfect for a camp cook working alone with no help and no breaks. Number 14, Swiss steak. The name had nothing to do with Switzerland. It came from the technique of Swissing, an old textile term for running fabric through heavy rollers to flatten and smooth it. That was exactly what you did to the meat. You took a cheap, tough cut of round steak, laid it on a board and pounded it with a meat mallet until the fibers broke down and the flour you pressed into both sides worked its way deep into the grain. Then you browned it hard in a hot skillet, laid it in a baking dish, covered it with canned tomatoes, sliced onions, and sometimes a diced green pepper, and baked it for 2 hours or more. The pounding and the long braising did what money could not. They turned a cut of beef that would have been too tough to chew into something tender enough to pull apart with the side of a fork. This was the meal families cooked when beef was on the table, but The budget only stretched to the cheapest piece in the case. The tomato sauce thickened around the meat as it baked, and by the time you pulled the dish out, the kitchen smelled like something slow and honest. You served it with mashed potatoes and poured the thick tomato pan sauce over everything on the plate. Swiss steak was one of the most common weeknight dinners in America for decades. It appeared in community cookbooks from coast to coast, and church suppers built whole menus around it. Today, most people under 50 have never heard the name. Number 17. Knockwurst with sauerkraut from a jar. Knockwurst is the fatter, stubbier cousin of the hot dog, and in the 1950s, every German-American neighborhood had a butcher who made them fresh. Your father bought them by the pound and grilled them whole until the casing split and the fat bubbled through the crack. He served them on a plate, not a bun, with a cold spoonful of Clausen or Silverfloss sauerkraut straight from the jar and a stripe of brown mustard. This was not fancy food. It was food your grandfather ate, and his father before him. The Knockwurst disappeared from most grocery stores by the 1980s, replaced by kielbasa and Italian sausage links. You can still find it in a few places if you look, but the fresh ones from the neighborhood butcher are gone for good. Most families in the 1950s owned one car, and it went to work with the husband every morning. So she walked. To the butcher, the baker, the five and dime, the post office, sometimes 2 or 3 stops before lunch, sometimes with a child on each hip and a cloth bag over her shoulder. A 1955 household guide estimated the average American housewife took 15,000 steps a day just keeping house, which works out to roughly 5.5 miles. Cardiologists now agree that consistent, low-intensity daily movement does more for long-term heart health than sporadic high-intensity workouts. She did not own a pedometer or a fitness tracker. She just had errands to run and no other way to run them. The walk home from the market was the only quiet she got some days, 10 minutes with no one pulling at her sleeve. She never called it exercise. She just called it Tuesday. Number 19. Milk toast. When someone was sick in 1950s America, this is what they got. You toasted a slice of bread, put it in a bowl, poured warm milk over it, and added a pinch of sugar or salt. Hospitals served it to patients who could not keep anything else down. Mothers made it for children with fevers. Old men with bad teeth ate it because they could not chew anything else. A bowl of milk toast cost about 4 cents. A quart of milk ran 20 cents in 1952, and one bowl only used a cupful. The toast soaked up the warm milk until it was soft enough for a baby to eat. It was soft enough for infants, gentle enough for the elderly, bland enough for the sick, filling enough for anyone who just needed something warm. In a world before antibiotics were common and doctor visits cost more than most families could afford, milk toast was the closest thing to medicine that a kitchen could produce. It was not memorable. It kept people going when nothing else could. Number 16. Creamed mushrooms on toast. Fresh button mushrooms sliced thick, sautéed in butter, and folded into a cream sauce with a little flour, whole milk, and thyme. The whole thing was ladled over 2 slices of toasted white bread and served on a plate. This was a meatless meal before anyone had a word for it. You ordered it when you did not feel like meat, and nobody questioned it. The mushrooms were earthy and rich, the sauce thick enough to stay on the toast without making it soggy, and the entire plate cost less than a Subway token. Automats treated this like a real meal, not an afterthought, and the people who ordered it came back for it week after week. It was honest food that respected the ingredient. Fast food never bothered with mushrooms at all, and when the automats closed, creamed mushrooms on toast went with them. Number 17. Tongue on rye with mustard. The slice was 1/4 of an inch thick, fanned across the rye in 3 overlapping pieces, topped with a smear of horseradish and a single round of yellow mustard. Beef tongue was cheap at the wholesale market on 14th Street, simmered for 4 hours with onions and bay leaves, peeled while still warm, and sliced cold on the bias. A tongue sandwich was 35 cents at Katz's in 1956. The flavor was rich and beefy, the texture more tender than brisket ever reached. The sandwich held its place on Jewish deli counters and corner luncheonettes through the late 70s. And then beef prices dropped. The immigrant generation aged out. The kids stopped ordering it. Katz's still serves it. Almost nobody else does. Your grandfather knew the rail cook by his first name, and the rail cook knew which mustard he wanted before he sat down. Number 24. Sassafras root tea. On a slow Sunday afternoon, a hill country cook would dig the red roots, scrub off the dirt, and boil them down into a rosy tea that tasted faintly of root beer and smelled like spring itself. It was the family tonic, served hot in winter to thin the blood and cold in summer to settle the stomach. The whole holler ran on it. Then in December of 1960, the Food and Drug Administration ruled that saffrole, the oil that gives sassafras root that warm flavor, caused liver tumors in lab animals. They declared any food containing it adulterated and pulled it from the market entirely. The root bark is roughly 80% saffrole by oil, so the genuine article was finished overnight. That is why store root beer lost its old bite and why a real cup brewed from the wild root crosses a line the government drew 60-some years ago. The Sunday tonic is now contraband. Lead-glazed ceramic cookware was once a kitchen treasure, bright, colorful, and imported from distant markets. Housewives displayed it proudly, unaware that each stew, soup, and sauce was quietly absorbing poison. When researchers discovered that the glazes leached lead into food, the shock spread fast. Imported pottery from Mexico, Italy, and even local artisans was pulled from stores. Families who had used the same pots for years were told to throw them away. It was a betrayal hidden in beauty, something meant to serve now seen as a silent killer. The government issued warnings, but for many, the damage was already done. The ban marked a turning point in how Americans thought about aesthetics and safety. A pot could be gorgeous and deadly at once. The message was clear. In the modern kitchen, trust had to be earned, not painted on. Number 17. Cold fried chicken wrapped in wax paper. This was not leftovers. Your mother fried the chicken on purpose the day before, let it cool on the counter, wrapped each piece in wax paper, and stacked it in the refrigerator so it would be cold and firm by the 4th. Cold fried chicken was its own category. The breading tightened overnight into a crust that had a snap when you bit down. The meat was dense and salty, and you could eat it with one hand while holding a sparkler in the other. No plate, no fork. Reynolds Wrap was on the market, but most women still used wax paper because it did not stick to the coating. You carried it to the cookout in a shoebox lined with a dish towel. The shoebox is gone, the wax paper is gone, and cold fried chicken as its own food went with them. Nobody in the Appalachian Hills called them morel mushrooms. They called them dryland fish, because when you sliced and pan-fried them in butter, they curled and crisped to something that looked, just barely, like a cast iron full of small fillets. Mark Sohn, in his Essential Appalachian Home Cooking, identifies morels alongside pawpaws, black walnuts, and wild ramps as defining foraged foods of the region, free for those who knew where to look. Morels fruited in specific hollows on specific south-facing slopes in the warming weeks of April after the red buds bloomed. You didn't find that hollow by searching. You were taken there once, by someone who'd been taken before you. Nobody drew a map. Today, farmers markets charge $20 a pound for a small paper bag, and restaurants feature them as a spring luxury. The hollow still holds its secret. Number 23. Old-fashioned caramels. Sugar, cream, butter, corn syrup, and vanilla. You cooked the batch to firm ball, poured it into a buttered pan, let it cool for an hour, and cut it into squares with a greased knife. Each piece got wrapped in wax paper with a twist at both ends. The wrapping took longer than the cooking. A single batch produced dozens of caramels, and every one of them needed its own paper jacket or the whole lot fused into a single amber slab by morning. The best caramels had a chew that lasted, not jawbreaker hard, not taffy soft, but somewhere right between where your teeth sank in slowly and the butter flavor rose up to meet them. Women made these in November and stored them in tins through December for gift boxes. They traveled well, kept their shape in the mail, and nobody ever returned a holiday box that had any caramels left inside. Number 22. Cabbage and kielbasa. A head of cabbage sliced thin, a ring of kielbasa cut into rounds, a little water in the bottom of a Dutch oven, and you let the whole thing simmer until the cabbage was tender and the sausage had given up its fat into the pot. Polish and Czech families in the Midwest and Great Lakes region ate this weekly. Cabbage lasted for days in the cellar and stretched further than almost any other vegetable. The kielbasa added salt and smoke without requiring a large portion. Some cooks threw in a few quartered potatoes. One pot, no fuss, and the kitchen smelled like supper for hours before anyone sat down. Number 24, tomato soup over rice. You opened a can of tomato soup, heated it up with a can of water, and spooned it over a plate of white rice. Some households added a pat of butter on top. This was not something you saw in cookbooks or on restaurant menus. It was something mothers invented on nights when the cupboard was thin and the clock was ticking. The soup gave it flavor, the rice gave it volume. Together, they added up to a meal that filled you up without asking much from the grocery budget. For a lot of families in the 1950s, this was a perfectly normal weeknight supper. Nobody apologized for it, and nobody asked for seconds because the pot was already empty. Number 24, rendering lard from leaf fat. You took the white fat from around the kidneys of a hog, cut it into small cubes, and put it in a heavy pot over the lowest heat you could manage. You stirred it every few minutes and watched it melt down into a clear, golden liquid. The little bits of tissue that did not melt turned into cracklings, and you lifted those out with a slotted spoon. What was left in the pot was pure lard. You poured it through cheesecloth into mason jars, and once it cooled, it turned white as snow. That lard made the flakiest pie crust you ever tasted, fried potatoes better than any oil on a store shelf, and lasted for months in a cool pantry without going rancid. One hog gave you enough cooking fat to last a family until spring. Before I go any further, this one is for the folks who want to hold on to recipes like these. I put together a collection of old recipes, the kind your grandmother kept in her head and never wrote down, all in one place. It is called the Vintage Recipe Guide, and you can find it on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I am not going to mention it again. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 21, molasses taffy. Molasses, sugar, butter, and a pinch of baking soda. You boiled it all together until it reached the right pull, buttered your hands, and started stretching. Two people stood across the kitchen pulling the rope of candy between them, folding it back, pulling again, over and over until the dark syrup turned pale gold and the texture went from sticky to smooth. The whole point was the pulling. Families made an evening of it. Neighbors came over. Kids took turns until their arms gave out. When the taffy was ready, you twisted it into a long rope, snipped it with scissors into bite-sized pieces, and wrapped each one in wax paper. The finished candy was chewy without being tough, and the molasses gave it a deep, burnt sugar flavor that plain taffy could never touch. Nobody bought molasses taffy at a store. You made it with the people you liked, and that was half the reason it tasted the way it did. Number 24, scrapple. A Pennsylvania Dutch invention made from pork scraps and trimmings cooked down with cornmeal and spices until the mixture was thick enough to slice. You poured it into a pan, let it firm up in the icebox, then cut it into slabs and fried them until the outside was crackling and dark. The inside stayed soft and rich, somewhere between sausage and polenta. Scrapple was the ultimate waste-nothing food. The parts of the hog that had no other use got a second life in that loaf pan. In eastern Pennsylvania and parts of Maryland, scrapple was breakfast food, but plenty of families ate it for dinner with a side of applesauce or fried eggs. Number 25, lima bean soup. A bag of dried lima beans, a ham bone, an onion, and a pot of water. You simmered the whole thing for hours until the beans broke down into a thick, starchy soup that stuck to your ribs and stayed there. Some cooks added a chopped potato to thicken it more. Others dropped in a bay leaf and let it ride. The ham bone gave it all the salt and smoke it needed, and the beans did the rest. This was a soup that could feed a household for 2 days on ingredients you could count on one hand. It was plain and honest and filling, and by the 1970s, it was gone from most American tables. Lima beans fell out of favor, and the soup went with them. Number 18, keeping a sourdough starter as your only leavening. You mixed flour and water in a jar, left it on the counter, and waited for the wild yeast in the air to find it. After a few days, it started bubbling. You fed it more flour and water every day, and within a week, you had a living starter that could raise bread, pancakes, biscuits, and even cake. No store-bought yeast, no baking powder, just a jar of flour paste that you kept alive the way you kept a fire going. Some Amish families had starters that had been passed down for decades. You gave a cup of it to a new bride as a wedding gift. That jar of starter was worth more than a set of dishes because it meant she could bake from the day she moved into her own kitchen. Number 30, son of a gun stew. This was the meal that used everything the animal had to give: heart, tongue, liver, kidney, marrow gut, and whatever trim came off the butchering block, all cut into chunks and slow cooked in a heavy cast iron pot with onions, salt, and black pepper. The name varied by region. Some camps called it SOB stew and left it at that. The broth turned dark and mineral-rich after hours on the back of the stove, and the texture was nothing like a regular beef stew. Every bite was different. Organ meat made it dense enough that a single bowl could carry a man through 4 hours of cross-cut saw work in January cold. Number 25, beef stroganoff, not the fancy version from a restaurant menu. The 1950s version. You sliced cheap round steak into thin strips and browned them fast in a hot skillet with butter and sliced onions. Then you stirred in a can of cream of mushroom soup, a splash of Worcestershire, and a dollop of sour cream. The whole thing simmered for 15 minutes while you boiled egg noodles on the back burner. You poured the stroganoff over the noodles and set it on the table, and it looked like something from a magazine. Betty Crocker put this recipe in her cookbook, and suddenly every housewife in the Midwest was making it on Tuesday nights. The sour cream made it taste rich, the mushroom soup made it easy, and the cheap cut of beef made it possible on a budget that had no room for tenderloin. Number 14. Barbecued meatloaf cooked on the grate. This sounds wrong until you have tasted it. Your father took the same meatloaf mixture your mother made during the week, shaped it into a flat oval 2 inches thick, and set it directly on the grill grate over medium coals with the lid down. The smoke formed a bark on the outside, almost like a brisket, while the inside stayed soft. After 40 minutes, he brushed the top with ketchup and brown sugar, closed the lid for another 10, and the glaze turned dark and sticky. You sliced it at the table and ate it between 2 pieces of sandwich bread with brown mustard and a thick round of raw onion. It happened because your mother handed him the mixture through the back door while he was already at the grill. Once he tried it, the oven version stopped making sense. Meatloaf itself fell out of fashion by the 1980s, but in 1957, a grilled one fed 5 people for under $1 and tasted better than anything at the diner in town. She kept a darning egg in the sewing basket, a smooth wooden tool shaped like a mushroom that she slipped inside a worn sock to stretch the fabric taut before weaving new thread across the hole. Every button that popped off a shirt went into the button box. Every hem that dropped got stitched back up the same evening. Frayed collars were unpicked, turned inside out, and sewn back on. The global fashion industry now produces an estimated 92 million tons of textile waste every year, and the slow fashion movement that emerged in response is essentially asking people to do what she did without thinking. Repair instead of replace, care for what you own, and stop treating clothing as disposable. Schools in the 1940s and 50s taught girls darning, hemming, and basic garment repair as part of the standard home economics curriculum. Those classes disappeared by the 1980s. The darning egg disappeared with them. Number 7, meatloaf. 1 pound of ground beef in 1955 cost about 39 cents. But you did not cook the beef straight. That would only feed 2 people, maybe 3 if they were small. You mixed it with breadcrumbs, an egg, diced onion, salt, pepper, and a little milk. The breadcrumbs soaked up the milk, and the egg held everything together. That single pound of beef became a loaf big enough for a family of 5 with leftovers for the next day. You shaped it, put it in a pan, glazed the top with ketchup, and baked it for an hour. The kitchen smelled like dinner for the first time all week. The leftover slices went into sandwiches the next day. Cold meatloaf on white bread with mustard was a lunch that factory workers and school children both knew by heart. 1 pound of beef, 2 meals. That was the genius of meatloaf. It was not a luxury. It was engineering. Every mother in America knew the ratio. Too many breadcrumbs and it fell apart. Getting it right was a skill passed from one generation to the next, and nobody wrote it down. They knew. Number 13, chicken fricassee. Bone-in chicken pieces braised low and slow in a white sauce built from butter, flour, chicken stock, and a bay leaf or two. The meat fell off the bone, and the sauce was pale, thick, and quiet in the way that old French-American cooking always was. No kick to it, no flash. But it was warm and deeply savory, and it filled your stomach for hours. Automats served this over rice or alongside boiled potatoes, and it was the kind of plate that grandmothers nodded at with approval. You ate it with a spoon because the sauce was too good to leave behind. Chicken fricassee required patience, and patience was exactly what the fast food industry decided it could not afford. By the late 1960s, it was already fading from automat menus, and today most people have never heard the word. Number 16, tuna melt. A short-order rail, one hot afternoon in 1959, tipped a bowl of tuna salad onto a half-grilled cheese sandwich and decided to keep going. The whole thing got pressed flat on the griddle and slid onto the plate. The customer asked for another. Within 3 years, the tuna melt was on lunch rails everywhere. Tuna salad on rye or sourdough, a single slice of cheese on top, a slick of butter on the griddle, heavy press for roughly 2 minutes each side. The cheese melted down into the tuna, the bread browned, the whole thing came off hot and a little messy. The fast food kitchens replaced the press with a panini machine, and the panini machine turned the tuna melt into something tighter and drier and entirely less interesting than the original. By the way, if any of these sandwiches sound like one your mother used to fix at home, I put together a recipe guide that walks through more like them. The proportions, the bread choices, the right way to cut a sandwich on the diagonal, and the small kitchen tricks the countercooks use to keep the lettuce crisp and the bacon hot through a 6-hour shift. The link is just below. Number 19, digging wild ginseng to flavor a tonic. Sang hunting was a hill country tradition older than the states themselves, and the gnarled root went into bitter teas, restoratives, and the occasional pot of medicine soup. A good patch was a family secret passed down in whispers. The wild plant is now one of the most tightly guarded in the woods. In 1975, American ginseng was placed on Appendix 2 of an international treaty that protects species from being dug into extinction, and the harvest is now boxed in by hard rules. Most states allow digging only during a narrow fall season, only from mature plants at least 5 years old, and selling out of state requires a dealer permit. The Forest Service has flat-out suspended ginseng harvesting across thousands of square miles of Appalachian National Forest, so that quiet walk into the hills to dig a root for the pot now runs straight into a wall of regulation. Absinthe had already been banned in the United States for decades, but the 1950s brought its ghost back into the spotlight. The green liqueur, infamous in Europe for its supposed hallucinogenic powers, was condemned all over again. Post-war America wanted stability, morality, and clean living, and absinthe represented everything it feared: indulgence, madness, and foreign decadence. The wormwood used to make it was accused of driving drinkers insane, a myth the media was all too happy to revive. When European imports tried to sneak their way back into American bars, customs agents seized them like contraband. The ban was reaffirmed, and absinthe returned to the realm of legend. It was the outlaw drink of poets and painters, far too wild for a nation chasing suburban perfection. By the 1950s, absinthe's glow faded into myth, replaced by sanitized cocktails and American whiskeys. What had once symbolized artistic rebellion was now a relic of sins no one dared to repeat. Number 25, olive loaf. If you opened a cooler at any 4th of July gathering in the 1950s, you found a stack of olive loaf sliced thin and curling at the edges. It came from the deli counter at the A&P, pressed smooth, studded with little pimento-stuffed green olives and sometimes a strip of pickle running through the center. You laid it on soft white bread with yellow mustard, and that was your sandwich. No arugula, no aioli, just cold processed meat with olives baked into it. Oscar Mayer and Eckrich both sold it by the pound, and your mother bought it by the half pound because it went further than you expected. Most delis stopped carrying it years ago, but in 1955, a fourth without olive loaf on the table was like a fourth without a flag on the porch. Rabbit was once the most democratic meat in America, small enough to raise in a backyard hutch on kitchen scraps, abundant in the wild for anyone with a .22 and an afternoon. Documented in the 1890s as the quintessential poor man's food for its low cost and fast reproduction, a dressed rabbit at a 1950s farm stand ran 30 or 40 cents. A hunted one cost nothing but a shell. The meat was mild, white, fine-grained, closer to chicken thigh than beef, with a sweetness that held up to long braising with onions and whatever root vegetables the garden was offering. She'd cut it into pieces, dredge it in seasoned flour, brown it in lard, and let it braise low and slow until the meat fell from the bone. What started as the cheapest protein on the place finished as the Sunday pot, the thing the family talked about on the walk home from church. Today, rabbit runs $12 to $15 a pound at specialty butchers. It left the American table sometime in the 1970s, slipping away quietly, and most people never noticed. Number 27, Panouche. Fudge made with brown sugar instead of cocoa, and it tasted like a praline married to caramel. Brown sugar, butter, milk, vanilla. You cooked it to soft ball, beat it until it thickened, and poured it into a pan. The name came from a Mexican-Spanish word for raw sugar. In New England, Panouche was the fudge people made when they wanted something other than chocolate. It had a deep, almost smoky sweetness that regular fudge could never reach. Some women dropped walnuts into the batch right before pouring. Others let it set plain and cut it into squares. It kept well in a tin, which made it a favorite for mailing to relatives who lived too far to visit. Number 27. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. A can of Campbell's tomato soup mixed with milk heated on the stove. 2 slices of white bread with American cheese pressed flat in a buttered skillet until the bread turned brown and the cheese pulled in strings. This was not a side dish. For millions of families in the 1950s, this was Tuesday night supper. The soup ran hot and tangy, and the sandwich carried enough richness to make the whole meal feel complete. Diners served the same pairing for more money, but most people made it at home because there was nothing to get wrong. You needed a can, a loaf, and a few slices of cheese, and everybody at the table ate. Number 28, hot dog and macaroni skillet. You boiled a box of elbow macaroni, sliced up a few hot dogs, and threw everything into a skillet with a can of tomato sauce. Some families added a handful of shredded cheese on top. Others did not bother. The whole thing took 15 minutes and cost less than most side dishes at a restaurant today. Kids loved it because it looked like real food, something with color and shape on the plate. It used up whatever was already in the pantry and did not require a trip to the store. This was a weeknight staple across the Midwest and the South, and it vanished quietly. People moved on. The recipe did not write itself down. Number 23, making vinegar from apple scraps. You saved the cores and peels from every apple you used, dropped them into a wide-mouthed jar, covered them with water and a spoonful of sugar, and tied a cloth over the top. Then you waited. After about 2 weeks, the liquid started to smell sharp and sour. After a month, it was vinegar. Real, usable apple cider vinegar made from scraps that most people threw in the compost pile. Amish women kept a vinegar jar going on the counter year-round, feeding it fresh scraps whenever they had them. That vinegar went into pickles, salad dressings, cleaning solutions, and home remedies. Some women kept 2 jars going at once, one for cooking and one for cleaning. You poured off what you needed and topped it up with fresh scraps and water. The jar never ran dry, and you never had to buy a bottle. Number 19, cornbread and beans. A full pan of cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet, crumbled into a bowl, and covered with a ladleful of hot beans straight from the pot. Simple as breathing. The cornbread soaked up the bean liquid and turned into something between a thick soup and a casserole, soft and savory and filling. Some men ate it with a spoon, others lifted the bowl and drank the last of it. In southern logging operations from East Texas all the way to the Carolina Piedmont, this was the default supper at least twice a week through the cold months when the supply wagon brought nothing fresh. Number 11. Hot dish, Minnesota, Wisconsin, the Dakotas. Everybody in those states knew exactly what this was. Ground beef browned in a skillet, mixed with a can of cream of mushroom soup and a can of green beans, poured into a casserole dish and topped with a layer of frozen tater tots. You baked it until the tots turned crispy and the filling bubbled underneath. Not casserole, not a bake. Hot dish. The name was regional and the loyalty was fierce. Church basements across the upper Midwest served some version of it at every potluck, every funeral, every Wednesday night supper. Some families used corn instead of green beans. Others added cheese on top. But the tater tots were the constant. You did not mess with the tater tots. That was the rule. Number 25. Tinfoil suppers. Your father tore off a square of Reynolds wrap, dropped a hamburger patty in the center, piled on sliced potatoes, half an onion cut into rings, and a handful of carrot coins, salt, pepper, a pat of butter. He folded it into a tight packet and set it right on the coals. No grate, no pan. Just foil and fire. 30 minutes later, he pulled it out with a pair of pliers, and when you tore the packet open, the steam carried everything good about a summer night. The meat browned on the bottom where it pressed against the foil, the potatoes went soft, and the onions melted into something sweet you could not get from a skillet. Every dad did this differently. Some added a slice of American cheese in the last 5 minutes. Some threw in a few green beans from a can. Nobody needed instructions because there were none to follow. Before the dryer became the default in every American laundry room, clotheslines stretched across nearly every backyard in the country. And the science behind them was better than anyone realized. Ultraviolet light from direct sunlight acts as a natural disinfectant, killing bacteria on fabric the same way UV lamps work in clinical settings. Your grandmother knew whites went in the sun and colors went in the shade, and she never read a study to figure that out. She could tell you exactly how to fold a bedsheet over the line so it dried without creasing. 1/3 draped over, hem to hem, wrong side out. Homeowners associations started banning clotheslines in the 1970s, calling them eyesores, and by the 1990s, most suburban yards had none at all. The fresh smell of sun-dried cotton came from a photochemical reaction between UV rays and wet fabric, something no dryer sheet has ever replicated. She hung laundry in the morning and brought it in by afternoon, and nobody thought to call it self-care. Nobody needed to. Number 22, cornmeal mush. A woman named Dottie Sims in western North Carolina made cornmeal mush every morning in 1956. She boiled water, stirred in cornmeal with a pinch of salt, and cooked it until it thickened into a dense, smooth porridge. Her children ate it hot with a drizzle of sorghum molasses. Whatever was left over, Dottie poured into a loaf pan. By evening, it had set firm. She sliced it, fried the slices in bacon grease until they were golden and crispy on the outside. The whole family sat down to fried mush for supper. A 5-pound bag of cornmeal cost about 23 cents and lasted a week. It was breakfast and dinner from the same pot. That was the kind of math poor families understood. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown away. Every ingredient pulled double duty. Number 17, cheese blintzes. Thin crepes filled with sweetened farmer cheese, folded into rectangles, and pan-fried in butter until the edges crisped up golden. Automats in New York City served these with a dollop of sour cream, and they sold as fast as the kitchen could fill the compartments. The cheese inside was mild and slightly sweet, almost like ricotta, but drier, and the crepe itself was barely thicker than paper. This was Eastern European food that had crossed the Atlantic with immigrant families and landed behind a glass door in Midtown Manhattan. A complete meal for a dime and one of the most popular items in the building on any given morning. Women on their lunch breaks ordered 2 at a time and ate them standing at the counter. Cheese blintzes retreated to a handful of Jewish delis when the automats closed. and most Americans under 60 have never tasted one. Number 19. Cottage cheese on date nut bread. Slicing the bread out of a tin can was the strange small ritual at the start. Thomas's and B&M both sold dense, dark, sweet date nut loaves shaped exactly to the can, and the cook sliced thick and never toasted. Cottage cheese went on cold, a generous scoop of small curd, lightly salted, with one thin round of canned pineapple on top. The sandwich was strange and beautiful, like an afternoon dressed up just enough to feel like an event you had not earned but were grateful for. You could order it at Schraft's with a glass of iced tea, and the waitress would set it down on a paper doily. It was on every Schraft's menu for 20 years, and it disappeared the year Schraft's itself began to close stores. The date nut bread in a can went out of production at B&M in 1992. Women in their 80s still remember the exact taste, and there is no place left that will make it for them. Number 23. The home hog killing and the meat that went out the back door. When the first hard frost hit, whole communities gathered for hog killing day, and the work fed more than one family. A man would dress out his hog, smoke the hams, render the fat, and pass cuts to a neighbor who paid him back with eggs or a few dollars. That swapping kept everyone fed through the lean months. But under the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the rules turn on the sale, not the size of it. The moment money or barter changes hands for uninspected meat, it becomes a federal violation, even between neighbors of 40 years. The custom exemption only covers an animal slaughtered for the owner's own table, and the person eating it had to own the live hog first. So the friendly backdoor trade that kept a hollow-fed is now squarely against the law. Home-cured bacon was once the pride of farmhouse kitchens, salted, hung, and smoked with care. Families passed down curing recipes like heirlooms, believing that a bit of salt and thyme could preserve more than just meat. It could preserve self-sufficiency. But in the 1950s, science stepped in with a warning. Nitrates, long used in curing, might not be as harmless as they seemed. Studies found they could turn into carcinogenic compounds when heated, sparking one of the earliest food safety scares of the modern age. The government began regulating their use, and homemade bacon suddenly fell under suspicion. People were told to buy factory-sealed packages instead, stamped with federal approval and safety codes. For rural households, it felt like losing a piece of freedom. The smoky scent of bacon in the smokehouse became a relic, replaced by the sterile shine of refrigerated aisles. Once a symbol of self-reliance, home curing was now a risk too great to take. Number 18. Deviled eggs with paprika. Not the ones with sriracha and truffle oil that show up on cooking programs today. The 1950s deviled egg was simple. You boiled a dozen eggs, cut them in half, mashed the yolks with mayonnaise, yellow mustard, sweet pickle relish, and a pinch of salt. You spooned the filling back into the whites and dusted the top with paprika so thick it turned each egg orange. They sat on a cut glass deviled egg plate, the kind with the little oval indentations that your mother got as a wedding gift and used exactly twice a year, Easter and the 4th. Deviled eggs still exist, but the plate is gone. The heavy paprika is gone. The way 24 perfect halves showed up at every gathering without anyone being asked, that part is gone. Wild asparagus grew in roadside ditches across the Midwest, thin, purple-tipped, pushing up in late April in the same spots year after year along fence rows and irrigation channels where someone scattered seed decades ago and let the plants go native. Knowing which ditch held them was the kind of knowledge handed down the way land once was, carefully, specifically, to the people who deserved it. You had to know the road, the exact stretch, and arrive before anyone else. The window between too small and too tough ran 3 days. She snapped them just above the soil, wrapped them in a damp cloth, and steamed them 5 minutes over boiling water. No more. The test was the tip. Yield without collapsing. Dressed with butter and salt, those roadside spears tasted of the specific morning they were cut, which is a flavor no farmed asparagus has ever matched. Today, fresh asparagus runs $4 to $6 a pound, uniform and trucked and seasonal on a grocery schedule. The roadside kind doesn't appear on any price list. It's gone, for everyone who didn't know which ditch. Number 24, rum balls. Crushed vanilla wafers, powdered sugar, cocoa, corn syrup, and rum. No baking required. You mixed everything in a bowl, rolled the mixture into small balls, and coated them in powdered sugar or cocoa. They sat in a tin for a day or two, and the flavor deepened every hour. These showed up at every holiday party next to the divinity and the fudge, and they were always the first to go. The rum was never subtle. You could smell it the moment the lid came off. Children were told to stay away from the plate, which only made them more determined. Some women used bourbon instead. Others swore by brandy. The debate never settled because every version worked and nobody was wrong. Number 30. Corn oysters. Sweet corn kernels scraped off the cob, mixed with egg, flour, salt, and pepper, then dropped by the spoonful into a skillet of hot lard. The batter puffed up as it fried, and the edges turned brown and crisp while the center stayed soft and sweet. They were called oysters because the shape and the golden crust resembled a fried oyster. Farm families across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic made these all through corn season because the ingredient list was whatever you already had. You piled them on a plate and ate them with nothing else, or alongside a slice of ham if the budget allowed. Number 18, beans and franks. A can of baked beans and a few sliced hot dogs heated together in a pot or baked in the oven with a little brown sugar and mustard on top. A full dinner in a lot of homes, and nobody questioned it. The beans gave you the protein and the bulk. The hot dogs gave you something to chew on. Together, they made a meal that took about 10 minutes to put together and fed everyone at the table. This showed up at church suppers, scout campouts, and kitchen tables every week across the country. It was never glamorous. It was never meant to be. And somewhere along the way, people decided it was not real food anymore. Number 25, salt layering vegetables in stoneware crocks. You took a clean crock, laid down a handful of green beans or sliced cucumbers, and covered them with a thick layer of coarse salt. Then another layer of vegetables, then more salt. You kept going until the crock was full, pressed a plate on top, weighed it down with a clean rock, and set it in the cellar. The salt pulled water out of the vegetables and created its own brine. No canning equipment, no boiling water, no sealed lids. Just salt and patience. Amish families kept crocks like these going from late summer all the way through March. The vegetables came out firm, salty, and perfectly preserved. You soaked them in cold water before cooking to pull out the excess salt, and they tasted like they had come out of the garden that morning. Number 23, venison stew. In camps near good hunting ground, deer meat showed up regularly through fall and winter. The cook cut it into cubes, browned it hard in a Dutch oven with lard, then added potatoes, carrots if the supply had them, onions, and water. Venison stew cooked slow and quiet all afternoon on the back of the stove. The meat was leaner than beef and tougher if you rushed it, but given enough time it fell apart the same way, and the broth took on a wild, deep flavor that beef could never match. Some cooks added a splash of vinegar to cut the gamey taste. Others left it alone and let the men decide for themselves whether they liked it. Number 16, tamale pie. This was not a tamale, and it was not really a pie. But nobody cared what you called it, because it disappeared from the dish before you could argue about the name. You browned ground beef with onion and chili powder, stirred in canned tomatoes and a handful of sliced black olives, and poured it into a casserole dish. Then you spread a thick layer of cornmeal batter over the top and baked it until the crust turned golden and pulled away from the edges. The cornmeal top cracked when you cut into it, and underneath was a thick, spicy, meaty filling that tasted like a tamale without any of the work. Church cookbooks across the Southwest printed this recipe so often the pages were stained with grease. One dish, one oven, no rolling corn husks, no steaming for hours. It was the shortcut that actually worked. Number 18. Barbecued beef short ribs. Your father bought these because the butcher practically gave them away. A full pound cost less than a single decent steak, and he would grab 3 or 4 pounds without a second thought. Each piece had a thick cap of fat on one side and a strip of meat clinging tight to the bone, and the whole game was patience. He set them on the cooler side of the grill and turned them every 10 or 12 minutes, letting the fat render down slow. Sauce went on near the end so it glazed instead of burning. When they were done, the bones stuck out at odd angles, and you grabbed them with both hands and gnawed the meat right off. Nobody put short ribs on a nice plate. They were standing-up food, eaten over the grass with sauce on your chin and grease running past your wrists, and nobody caring one bit. The chemical industry spent decades convincing American housewives they needed a different product for every surface in the house. One for glass, one for tile, one for porcelain, one for wood. Your grandmother needed two. White vinegar, naturally antibacterial and able to cut through grease on contact, and baking soda, a mild abrasive that lifts stains without scratching. When combined, the two produce a carbon dioxide reaction that loosens grime from grout, drains, and oven interiors without releasing a single airborne toxin. She kept a spray bottle of diluted vinegar under the sink and a box of Arm & Hammer beside it. And between the two, she cleaned everything from kitchen counters to bathroom tile. Modern toxicology studies have linked regular use of commercial spray cleaners to a 20% increase in respiratory problems. She paid pennies for what worked. The rest of us paid dollars for what smelled like a chemical plant. Number 11. Rice and gravy. In southern Louisiana and East Texas, rice and gravy was not a side dish. It was the meal. You cooked a pot of white rice. You made gravy from pan drippings, flour, and water. You poured the gravy over the rice. A 25-pound bag of rice in 1955 cost about $2 and lasted a family a month. That worked out to a few cents per serving. The gravy came from whatever meat you had cooked earlier in the week. Pork chops, chicken, even bacon. You scraped the brown bits from the bottom of the pan, added a spoonful of flour, stirred in water, and let it thicken into something dark and rich. The whole plate cost a few pennies. Cajun families and poor black families across the Gulf Coast ate rice and gravy 3 or 4 nights a week. It was filling. It was warm. And the gravy turned plain rice into something that tasted like a meal someone had put thought into. You did not need much. You needed to know what to do with what you had. Number 20. Turkey croquettes. Automats went through enormous amounts of roasted turkey, and whatever was left at the end of the day got ground up, mixed with a thick white sauce, shaped into cylinders, breaded, and fried the next morning. The inside was creamy and rich and tasted like Thanksgiving leftovers pressed into a stick. The outside had a golden crust that shattered when you cut into it with a fork. They came 2 per plate with gravy on the side and a scoop of mashed potatoes. For 20 cents, you had a full hot lunch made from real roasted turkey, not a processed patty shaped to look like one. Turkey croquettes required fresh roasted birds and hand rolling, and when the automats closed, nobody else was willing to do that work. Number 23. Olive nut on white toast. Stirring cream cheese soft with the back of a fork was how the recipe started. Chopped green olives with the pimento still in them, and toasted black walnuts, all folded until the mixture turned pale yellow, flecked with red and brown. Spread on white toast and cut diagonally. The sandwich showed up in every Better Homes and Gardens cookbook for 15 years and then quietly disappeared. Cream cheese moved on to bagels. Olives moved on to martinis. The black walnuts went the hardest because nobody was harvesting them anymore. The olive nut was simple and beautiful in an odd way, like a tea party leftover that the working world had borrowed for an hour. Now you can go a year of eating in restaurants and never once see one on a plate. Number 25. The backwoods moonshine still. Up the hollers, a copper still was as much a part of the kitchen as the cook stove, and nobody up there thought twice about it. A family ran corn mash through a pot still, caught the clear liquor off the worm, and used it to trade, to doctor a sore throat, or to splash into a fruitcake. It paid the taxes when crops failed and kept the cabinet stocked when the nearest store was a half-day mule ride away. Here is the catch. Distilling spirits at home is a federal crime under Title 26, Section 5601 of the United States Code, with no exception carved out for personal use. You can brew your own beer and ferment your own wine, but the moment that vapor condenses into liquor, you are looking at a felony carrying up to 5 years and a $10,000 fine. That self-stilled spirit the old folks poured so freely is now strictly off-limits. Cyclamate sweeteners promised guilt-free sweetness long before diet culture had a name. Housewives sprinkled it into coffee, dieters swore by it, and soda companies celebrated it as the taste of the future. But when lab tests linked cyclamates to cancer in rats, the panic spread faster than the rumors themselves. By the late 1950s, government regulators stepped in, pulling the sweetener from shelves in a sudden sweep that shocked the public. For millions, it was the first time they realized their pantry could be hiding a threat. What was once a symbol of modern convenience became a warning about how far science could go in the name of progress. The ban exposed a growing divide between trust in innovation and fear of what it might cost. The taste of safety turned bitter, and Americans began to question every miracle ingredient that followed. Cyclamate sweeteners faded, but their shadow lingered over every sugar substitute that came after, from saccharin to aspartame. The country learned that even sweetness had consequences. Number 16. The flag cake. Every neighborhood had one, and it was always the same. A sheet cake baked in a 9 by 13 pan, frosted with real whipped cream beaten from a pint carton with a hand mixer until it held peaks. The blue field was a square of blueberries in the upper left corner. The red stripes were rows of sliced strawberries. The white stripes were the cream itself. It was beautiful for about 20 minutes before the cream started sliding in the heat and the berries bled juice into the frosting. You ate it fast, standing in the shade with a paper plate bending under the weight. The cake underneath was a box mix, Duncan Hines or Betty Crocker, and that was fine. The flag was the point. The cake was just the canvas. Government cheese arrived in a block so large it barely fit in the refrigerator drawer. Dense, sharp, impossibly orange, distributed through the USDA commodity program to dispose of dairy surpluses and feed low-income families. You didn't buy it. A neighbor brought it, or your aunt picked it up from the distribution point, or the church had a stack in the fellowship hall on the third Saturday. The cheese was remarkable, sharper and saltier than anything the supermarket packaged in slices, melting in ways that transformed a pot of macaroni into something different. It was a specific sharpness, a specific density, a specific smell when you peeled back the wax. Today, that cheese is gone from assistance programs, replaced by commodity Velveeta. The block that fed a generation left no commercial descendant and no exact replica. Number 30. Chocolate fudge. This was the candy every girl learned to make before she learned to drive. Sugar, cocoa, butter, milk, and a splash of vanilla. You boiled it low and slow, stirred it steady, and poured it into a buttered dish when it reached the soft ball stage. The trick was knowing when to stop stirring. Too early, and it stayed runny. Too late, and it seized into a grainy block. But when you got it right, it set into a slab so smooth you could nearly see your reflection. Church bake sales sold it by the square on wax paper. Neighbors traded recipes that differed by 1 tablespoon of butter and swore theirs was the real one. Nobody bought fudge in a box. You made it, or somebody who cared about you made it for you. Number 20. Fried bologna with mashed potatoes. A thick slice of bologna scored around the edges so it would not curl, fried in a dry skillet until the outside blistered and browned. Serve it on a plate next to a pile of mashed potatoes made from real potatoes, butter, and milk. This was a working-class dinner that showed up in lunchbox towns and factory cities across the Rust Belt and the Ohio Valley. Bologna was one of the cheapest deli meats you could buy, and frying it changed the texture completely. The outside got crispy and a little smoky. The inside stayed soft. Mashed potatoes turned it into a plate that looked and felt complete. No one bragged about serving it. Everyone cleaned their plate. Number 19. Porcupine meatballs. You mixed ground beef with raw rice, an egg, and a little onion. Shaped the mixture into balls, dropped them into a pot of tomato sauce, and let the whole thing simmer for about an hour. As the meatballs cooked, the rice inside swelled up and poked through the surface, giving them a spiky look that earned the name. Kids thought they were hilarious. The rice stretched the meat further than breadcrumbs ever could, the tomato sauce made its own gravy, and everything cooked in one pot without a single side dish needed. This was a meal that entertained children and stayed inside a grocery budget at the same time. It was clever, and it worked every time. Number 17. Wrapping cheese in vinegar-soaked cloth. You tore a piece of muslin or clean cotton, dipped it in plain white vinegar, wrung it out, and wrapped it tight around a block of hard cheese. Then you stored the cheese in the cellar or the coolest corner of the pantry. The vinegar kept mold from forming on the surface. When the cloth dried out, you soaked it again. A wheel of cheddar wrapped this way lasted for months without a single spot of mold. No plastic wrap, no wax coating, just a damp cloth and vinegar. The cheese aged slowly in the cool air and actually tasted better after a few weeks than it did on the day you wrapped it. You could keep rewrapping with fresh vinegar cloth as often as you needed, and the cheese just kept improving. Number 20. Mulligan stew. If son of a gun stew was the organ meat version, mulligan was the everything else version. Whatever the cook had on hand went in without apology. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, cabbage, scraps of beef too small to serve alone, a ham hock, barley if he had it, a handful of dried beans if he did not. It simmered in the biggest pot available all morning, and no two batches ever tasted the same because no 2 days had the same leftovers. The name came from the hobo camps and rail yards of the Depression era, but it lived on in timber country well into the 50s because the principle was identical. Nothing wasted. Everything fed somebody. Every scrap earned its keep. Number 20. Creamed eggs on toast. You hard-boiled half a dozen eggs, peeled them, and chopped them into rough chunks. Then you made a white sauce in a saucepan, the same one you used for everything else. Butter, flour, and milk, stirred until it thickened. You folded the chopped eggs into the sauce and spooned the whole thing over slices of toast on a plate. Some families called it goldenrod eggs because of the color. Others just called it eggs on toast and moved on. The meal cost almost nothing and took 15 minutes. It showed up on Friday nights in Catholic homes and on any night the grocery money had run thin. You added salt and pepper and maybe a few canned peas on the side, and that was dinner. Nobody remembered it fondly. Everybody ate it. Number 20. Spit-roasted chicken on the rotisserie attachment. In 1956, Weber and a handful of other companies started selling rotisserie kits that bolted onto the side of a standard kettle grill. Your father saved up for one and treated it like a piece of scientific equipment. He ran the spit rod through a whole chicken, tightened the prongs, and set the battery-powered motor turning slow circles above the coals. The bird dripped into a tin pan underneath, and every 15 minutes he brushed the drippings back over the skin with a long-handled brush. 2 hours later, the skin was tight and golden, and the meat fell apart when you pulled it. He stood by the window watching it turn like he was guarding something valuable. Most of those rotisserie attachments rusted out within a few seasons because nobody sold replacement parts. Long before the word probiotic appeared on a yogurt label, she was packing cucumbers into mason jars with salt brine and dill, setting crocks of sauerkraut in the cellar, and putting up green tomato relish every September. Lactofermentation, preserving vegetables in salt water until beneficial bacteria convert their natural sugars into lactic acid, does something no canning or freezing method can match. It creates live cultures that support gut health. The difference between a true fermented pickle and a vinegar-pickled one is the difference between medicine and imitation. She knew that by taste alone, the real ones had a tang that bit the back of your tongue, and the jars sometimes hissed when you cracked the seal because the bacteria were still alive. Today, the probiotic supplement industry generates billions selling capsules that deliver a fraction of what one jar of her sauerkraut provided for free. The crocks are mostly gone now. The cultures she kept alive for decades, passing brine from one batch to the next, went quiet when she did. In 1953, a woman named Edna Watkins in Harlan County, Kentucky, fed a family of 7 on less than $4 a week. She had flour, lard, and whatever she could grow in the side yard. Her youngest daughter said she never once heard her mother complain. That is the story of the 1950s. Millions of families were not living the post-war dream you see in the magazines. They were cooking the way their mothers cooked during the Depression. 3 ingredients, 4 at most, whatever was in the cupboard. Number 18 on this list gave poor families every nutrient they needed for pennies. Number 8 was a military staple that mothers turned into legend. Number 1 is the original poor man's meal that started it all. These meals were not fancy. They tasted better than anything you can buy in a store today. If that sounds worth remembering, subscribe now. We are counting down from 25. Number 22, corn chowder. Thick and creamy, built on salt pork, diced potatoes, corn kernels, and whole milk. Not cream of corn from a can. Real corn chowder with chunks you could feel on your spoon. Automats in the Northeast served this from September through March, and it was the kind of bowl you wrapped both hands around when the weather turned. A 5-cent cup could hold you together until supper. The potatoes were cut rough, the corn still had a little crunch to it, and the broth carried that fatty, smoky edge from the salt pork. You could eat it with crackers or just drink it straight from the bowl, and either way, it was the cheapest hot meal in the building. Fast food soup stations never picked this one up because it took too long to make properly, and the powdered versions that came later tasted like nothing at all. Number 13, ham salad on white. Tuesday was ham salad day on Midwestern lunch counters from 1949 through about 1979. The cook ran Sunday's leftover ham through a hand grinder, watched it come out in a pink rope, and mixed it with mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, a chopped hard-boiled egg, and a pinch of dry mustard. He spread it thick on white bread, cut it in half, and served it with potato chips and a dill spear. A Kresge's in Cleveland sold ham salad on white for 30 cents in 1958. A Woolworth's in Indianapolis charged 28 cents. A working family of 4 could stretch the same ham across an entire week, fresh on Sunday, sliced on Monday, ground into salad on Tuesday. The cook's grocery bill ran $1.50 for the week's protein. The dressing got Tangier each day as the relish bled into the mayo, and Friday's sandwich tasted nothing like Tuesday's. By the 80s, the hand grinder went into the back of the cabinet. The cooks bought pre-made ham salad in plastic tubs, and the tubs went stale on the shelf. The Sunday leftover version is gone. Number 14, hunting a deer for the table and selling the surplus. A buck taken in the fall fed a hill family through the worst of winter, and there was nearly always more venison than one household could eat. So the extra got sold or swapped down the road, smoked sausage for cash, a hindquarter for a debt. Market hunting like that is now almost entirely outlawed. The Federal Lacey Act, first passed in 1900, makes it illegal to sell, transport, or trade any wildlife taken in violation of state or federal game law. The instant you sell wild venison across a state line, or sell a deer taken out of season, a simple swap becomes a federal crime, and once the value tops $350, it climbs to a felony. The casual sale of wild meat that once carried families through the cold months is now one of the oldest prohibitions on the books. Color-dyed margarine turned into one of the strangest food wars of the 1950s. Dairy farmers saw it as a threat to their livelihood, a cheap imitation stealing butter's golden glow. State after state passed laws banning yellow margarine, forcing companies to sell it as a pale, unappetizing white slab. In some places, you had to mix your own coloring packet at home just to make it look edible. The butter wars became a battle between old-fashioned tradition and modern convenience. Families who couldn't afford butter felt punished for trying to stretch their grocery budgets. Politicians called the dye deceptive. Homemakers called the laws ridiculous. In truth, it was never really about color. It was about control. Food was becoming industrial, and the fight for margarine's hue symbolized something deeper. Who had the right to decide what Americans ate? Eventually, the bans faded, but the lesson lingered. Sometimes, the biggest battles over food have nothing to do with taste at all. Number 23, stuffed celery sticks. You took a bunch of celery, cut it into 4-inch pieces, and piped the hollows full of cream cheese mixed with chopped green olives and a pinch of garlic salt. Some women used cheese whiz, some used pimento spread. What mattered was that the celery showed up on a glass tray lined with wax paper, arranged in a fan shape like somebody meant it. Stuffed celery was the appetizer before the word appetizer existed at a backyard party. You picked one up and ate it while the burgers were still too raw to touch. Now the celery comes pre-cut in a bag with a tub of ranch, and that is a different thing entirely. There is a moment in oxtail's history when the story turns. When a cut butchers practically begged people to take becomes something with a price tag that makes adults pause at the counter. In Black Southern kitchens, oxtail was never the unwanted cut it seemed elsewhere. Culinary historian Adrian Miller, author of Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, documents how the cuts left after prime butchering, the tail, the feet, the stomach, became raw material for a tradition that turned time and skill into something no prime cut could replicate. Oxtail braised 3 to 4 hours with aromatics and low heat, the collagen dissolving into a dark, glossy gravy, produced a depth a tenderloin couldn't approach at any price. Today, oxtail runs $12 to $15 a pound, and communities who built their tables around it find themselves priced out. The alchemy worked too well. Number 28. Sourdough flapjacks. Every camp cook kept a sourdough starter going year-round. Some of those starters were years old, carried from camp to camp in a crock wrapped in a wool blanket to keep it from freezing on the wagon ride. The flapjacks came off the griddle the size of a dinner plate, golden and slightly sour, stacked 5 or 6 high on a tin plate. Butter and cane syrup went on top. A man could eat a dozen before his first shift and think nothing of it. The starter was the cook's most prized possession. Lose it in winter and you had no leavening until spring supply came through. Some cooks slept with the crock beside them on cold nights just to keep the cultures alive. Number 12. Codfish cakes. Salt cod soaked overnight in cold water, then flaked and mixed with mashed potato, a beaten egg, and black pepper. You shaped the mixture into thick patties and fried them in a skillet until both sides turned deep golden brown. In Catholic families across New England and the Mid-Atlantic, this was Friday dinner every single week. The church said no meat on Fridays, and salt cod was cheap and kept for months without refrigeration. The outside of each cake went crispy while the inside stayed soft and flaky. You served them with tartar sauce or a squeeze of lemon and a side of coleslaw. By the late 1970s, most families had stopped buying salt cod entirely, and codfish cakes went from a weekly ritual to something only grandmothers still knew how to make. Number 22. Hamburger steaks on the grill. These were not hamburgers. There was no bun, no ketchup, no pickle. Your father shaped ground chuck into thick oval patties, pressed his thumb into the center so they would not puff up, and laid them directly on the hottest part of the grate. Salt on the way down, pepper when they came off. You ate them on a plate with a knife and fork like any other steak because to your father that is exactly what they were. A pound of ground beef from the butcher counter fed the whole family if you served it next to a baked potato and a pile of sliced tomatoes from the garden. The butcher ground it fresh while you waited, and the fat content was whatever he decided that morning. Monday was wash day, Tuesday was ironing, Wednesday was mending, Thursday was baking, Friday was shopping, Saturday was heavy cleaning, Sunday was rest. She kept this rotation not because a book told her to, though plenty of books did, but because the sheer volume of domestic work demanded a system, and systems require rhythm. Behavioral psychologists now understand that routine reduces decision fatigue and lowers cortisol, the stress hormone that wears the body down over time. Every 1950s homemaking guide insisted a schedule was the backbone of a well-run household, and modern cognitive science agrees. When the brain does not have to decide what comes next, it conserves energy for the tasks that matter. She woke at the same hour, cleaned in the same order, cooked at the same time, and went to bed knowing exactly what tomorrow held. From the outside, it looked rigid. From the inside, it was the closest thing to freedom she had. Number 9. Fried egg sandwich. 2 eggs, a skillet, 2 slices of bread. That was the whole operation. In 1952, a dozen eggs cost about 60 cents. That meant each egg was about 5 cents. A fried egg sandwich cost you a dime. You cracked the egg into a hot skillet with a little grease, let the white set and the edges get crispy, and put it between 2 slices of bread. Some people added salt, some added pepper. Some added a thin scrape of mayo. Fathers in Detroit ate these for dinner after the late shift at the auto plant. Mothers in Georgia made them for their children at noon. It did not matter who you were or where you lived. If money was tight, you knew the sandwich. It took 3 minutes. It filled your stomach. That was it. That was the whole recipe. Number 24, the baked beans plate. Horn and Hardart's baked beans were a religion in Philadelphia. They slow-cooked them overnight with molasses, salt pork, and mustard, then loaded them into those little glass compartments first thing in the morning. By 10 o'clock, the line was already forming. A full plate with brown bread on the side cost 15 cents, and people ate this for lunch or supper without a second thought. The recipe never changed in decades because it never needed to. When the last Horn and Hardart closed in 1991, that recipe went with it, and nobody has come close to matching it since. Before I go further, for the folks who want recipes like these all gathered in one place, I have put together the Vintage Recipe Guide, available at my website vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not push it again in this video. If you want it, it is there. Now, back to the list. Number 25, egg salad on white. Spreading egg salad using the rounded side of a spoon was the very first lesson a new waitress got at the rail. Knives were not allowed for this. 4 hard-boiled eggs, 2 tablespoons of mayonnaise, a pinch of celery salt, and a paper-thin slice of green pepper if you felt fancy. The bread was always white, always sliced thin, like a paper napkin folded around the filling. Waitresses cut sandwiches into triangles and stacked them on plates lined with leaf lettuce. Eaten standing at the rail in under 11 minutes. The dime store counters quietly closed. The drugstore lunchrooms closed. The sandwich went with them. Your grandmother could still make one by feel. Most of her grandchildren cannot. Number 13, gathering wild mushrooms to cook and sell. After a warm rain, the woods filled with morels, chanterelles, and chicken of the woods, and a sharp-eyed forager could fill a basket in an afternoon. Those mushrooms went into the skillet with butter and onions, and the extras got carried to the country store or the diner in town for a little money. That open trade is now fenced in tight. Under the FDA food code that most states follow, any wild mushroom offered for sale or served in a restaurant must be individually inspected and identified as safe by a certified mushroom expert. A handful of states allow it only with that trained certification, and several refuse foraged mushrooms outright as coming from an unapproved source. The reason is plain. One misidentified cap can kill, and there is no antidote for some of them. So the basket of wild mushrooms a forager once sold off the tailgate now demands a credential the old woods-wise gatherers never had. Fugu, the delicate Japanese pufferfish, had fascinated Americans since stories of its deadly potential reached their shores. The dish was exotic, forbidden, and thrilling. But in the 1950s, the government decided it was one risk too many. The toxin in fugu could stop a heart in minutes, and one wrong cut from a chef's knife meant disaster. The ban was absolute. Restaurants caught serving it faced heavy fines, and imports were confiscated before reaching ports. To the adventurous, it became a symbol of lost courage, a delicacy wrapped in danger that America simply could not trust. Yet its legend only grew. In post-war magazines, fugu was spoken of like a ghost of the East, deadly, beautiful, and untouchable. The ban was not just about safety, it was about fear of the unfamiliar. In trying to protect itself, America also closed its door to one of the world's most daring cuisines. Number 13, pickled beets and eggs. You took a quart jar of home-canned beets, poured the juice into a saucepan with extra vinegar, sugar, and a few whole cloves, brought it to a boil, and dropped in 6 hard-boiled eggs. You let the jar sit in the refrigerator for 2 days until the eggs turned magenta all the way through to the yolk. The flavor was sweet, sour, earthy, and cold, and you cut the eggs in half so people could see that impossible color. Every Pennsylvania Dutch family brought pickled eggs to the cookout. Every Midwestern farm wife had her own sugar-to-vinegar ratio. You can still find them at certain diners in Lancaster County, but the backyard jar has been empty for decades. The jar of pickled pig's feet sat on the counter of every rural southern kitchen and corner store. Wide-mouthed glass, brine cloudy with vinegar and spice, trotters packed in tight. Pig's feet were sold for pennies through the 1940s and 50s, in an era when the whole hog was still a complete transaction. Cleaned, simmered in seasoned water, packed with apple cider vinegar and red pepper flakes, and left to cure a week. What came from the brine was tender, gelatinous, sharp sour, eaten cold at the counter, and the knowledge of how to eat them, which parts in which order, was entirely unwritten. Today, pickled trotters appear in specialty shops at $4 to $6 each. The jar on the counter has mostly disappeared, along with the understanding of what it contained. Every one of those 100 meals started the same way. A woman at a stove with not quite enough, turning it into something her family would ask for again. She never weighed anything. She never timed anything. She just knew, because someone had shown her before that, and someone had shown that woman before her. If one of those dishes put a face in your mind just now, tell us who it was and what they used to make. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one we bring back.